My name's David Rice with Weber Basin Water Conservancy District. We've got Hetty Ann Fesselt joining us as well. We're going to be team teaching this course tonight on Localscape University. And so she'll be, well, anyway, I'll teach a section, she'll teach a section, kind of back and forth for a few different sections. So we just want to welcome everybody. Some of you have probably been to some of our other classes in this format, and we appreciate you joining us. We're glad we can make this work. It's not quite as ideal as meeting in person to be able to provide instruction and engage, answer your questions with your raise of your hand and all that kind of stuff. But this will work because it's what we have available to us at the time, to deal with this. So if you're unfamiliar with this, it's the first time you're joining us. For questions, you may have a little raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. We would invite you not to use that, but rather use the Q&A box and type your question in. Just the muting and unmuting participants and background noise and stuff. It's just better if you'll type your question in the Q&A box and we can answer those questions. One of us, either Hetty Ann or myself, will be in the background answering questions. And if we need it in between some sections, we'll pause. We'll address those questions verbally. We'll help you hopefully gain the understanding you need for the course and things pertaining to what you need. Just by way of a couple little details, this class specifically, we teach a whole range of classes. We taught a rose class. We're going to be doing perennials. We're going to be doing all kinds of different things, vegetables. But this one particularly fits right in line with the focus of the water district and water in terms of landscapes. And how we can be more effective with delivery of water and the use of water in our landscapes. About 60 to 65% of all municipal water goes in a landscape. Now, some of you have secondary water and in different situations. When we use that number, we're talking about water deliveries in both treated and secondary systems to take care of landscapes. It's about 65% of all water that's delivered to a municipality, total water. Now, of course, agriculture uses a lot of water and there's other uses everywhere. But for municipal use, residential outdoor irrigation is the highest. And so there's a lot of potential to be efficient without sacrificing the quality, the use, and the beauty of the landscape. So that's what this class is going to focus on. And so I think with that, we'll jump into it. If you're a little unfamiliar with Weber Basin Water, Weber Basin, we're a large regional wholesale provider of water to 4 counties, Davis, Weber, Morgan, and Summit counties. And so we're delivering treated drinking water to cities and then secondary water, ag water. And so we manage the water in the Weber and Ogden River drainage basins, the reservoirs that are on those canyons. Some of you recreated on those facilities, Pine View, East Canyon, Lost Creek, all those facilities, Causey Reservoir, those are the water supply reservoirs that supply water to our system and to the residents and the people, about 700,000 people in this northern area. So with that, I think we'll move right ahead. I'm going to share screen. I'm going to start tonight with just how we move forward and I may have to pause this. So anyway, I'll just start here with an introduction to Localscapes. If you're unfamiliar with this principle or this concept, Localscapes was originally designed, or the program kind of came about because people were looking for something to do differently that would save water, but without sacrificing the quality of a landscape. So Localscapes is landscaping for where you live. It's kind of a principle-based program that helps you understand and do things that fit for your soils, for your climate. Some of you are joining maybe from a little higher elevations. Maybe you're on the backside on the Ogden Valley area. Maybe you're outside of the Wasatch Front here. There's small differences in where you live. And so Localscapes is a principle-based thing that you can apply the principles to wherever you live and be successful. So there's 5 basic elements of a Localscape plan, or a Localscape program. And there are some brochures to these. If you're ever up at our office, you could swing by and grab a brochure. But I'm going to go through these. Just watch the slides because it's going to highlight on this little map the thing we're talking about. So these are the basic 5 steps to create a Localscape. And we'll be discussing these in detail tonight. So the first one is creating a central open shape. Simply a defined element It's usually lawn, but it could be hardscape, it could be ground cover. And usually there's an area, a central open shape in a front yard and a backyard, but we'll discuss the details of how these fit into different types of yards and different locations, corner lots and that kind of thing. Second one is gathering areas, is, using, well, it's figuring out what you need your landscape to provide for you in terms of, do you entertain? Do you like to just be in a private space by yourself or your family? So these are patios, seating areas, fire pits, decks. These are the spaces where you like to gather. Consider them extensions of your home or extensions of your living space, but it's outside. So that's number two. Number three, activity zones. These are areas that are similar to gathering, but they're the activity things you do with your space. And if you have kids, of course, you're designing something a little different. If you have pets, you may be designing activity zones and central open shapes a little differently. This is trampolines, vegetable gardens, swimming pools, all kinds of the activity, sandboxes, playhouses, swing sets, all these kind of things are what's considered activity zones. So you're thinking of open shapes, you're thinking of gathering, you're thinking of what do I do active wise, or my kids or whoever. And then how do you connect it all together? What's the easiest transition between your spaces? This is simply the paths concept, and it's what materials to be used in those. So we'll get to details on those. And then of course, planting beds takes up the rest. Now, a lot of the landscape design principles, a lot of times people go opposite of this, and it's not, well, won't say it's correct. It's easier if you follow these steps, because then you're designing intentional spaces, and then you fill plants into those other spaces rather than trying to design all the plant spaces and fit your other spaces in between. So it's just a logical, thought through process, 5 steps to create a landscape that's functional and beautiful and meets your needs. So tonight we're going to show you and teach you how to create a base map that'll help you get started. Now, these principles apply to new landscapes as well as existing if you're trying to make changes. So some of these principles kind of seem like maybe, this is just geared to new. It's not. If you're struggling with an existing landscape, you can follow these same steps, but rather than just a blank slate you start adding, you might be doing a step-by-step phased-in approach where you take one area of your yard and change that area and then kind of move through. But the planning is the same for either. You need to have a plan in mind so you can work through your plan to be successful when you end. So tonight you'll learn about those. I already talked about the 5 things you'll learn. We'll talk about some plant selection basics. In this class, we won't have time to get into all the nitty-gritties of plant choices with names of plants and all that kind of stuff. But we're going to get you plant selection basics, and then we're even going to talk that maintenance part. The maintenance for some is like, I don't want to know that. We're going to try to talk about things that'll help make this easier for you. All right, so first of all, let's talk the base maps. And this is just there's a couple slides that are going to help you understand what a base map is and how to accurately draw one to scale, show the various elements that are fixed and permanent. This is your driveway, your house, sheds, physical structures. And so a base map needs to include all those. And to be as useful as it needs to be, you should probably try to draw it to scale. I mean, if you're just hand sketching some things and it's not to scale, it's useful to some degree if you're just doing some conceptual stuff. But once you really start getting into a landscape, you need to have the distances in mind, or you'll start selecting plants and trees and you realize, I bought a tree that's going to get 50 feet tall and I only have a 10-foot space. That kind of stuff, you don't want to run into any of that. So get an accurate, good plan to start with. And so I'm going to show you a little video here in just a second that will hopefully help you understand how to do some of these measurements. So there's 2 ways to do this. Option A is simply, you can get a base map from the county. They have plot maps that'll kind of show your lot boundaries, any easements on the property. So your builder, your city, they will have some of this, just like the illustration here in the slide. It shows the footprint of the house. It shows where some things are. Now, if there's been improvements on it, it may not show any of those. This is usually stuff that's done when the development happens. So if an extra deck's been built on or a shed's been built somewhere, it may not have any of that on the basic plot map. but that's a good place to start. Option B is you can measure your landscape yourself. You can take out a wheel tape measure, just a tape measure itself, a wheel measure, or Google Maps. And I'm going to show you how to do that with Google Maps through this little video. So I'm hopeful that this, here we go.
Hello.
Now, if anybody can't hear this, if you'll type in the Q&A or something, but I'm going to get it started again. If you have problems, let us know. I'll restart it. Whoops, shoot. Let me go back. Here we go.
Hello, I'm Cynthia with Localscapes, and in this video, we're going to teach you how
Sorry about that.
to create a base map for your property using Google Maps. To accurately plan landscape projects, you must first get the layout, measurements, and dimensions of your property. Google Maps is a great way to do this because it allows us to not only get those dimensions, but also locate real-world elements such as existing trees without having to go outside and measure anything. To get started, go to maps.google.com, then type in your property address in the search bar in the top left corner. Once you've located the property, zoom in. In the bottom left corner, we can switch between the map view and the satellite view as needed. The map view is the easiest way to measure the property, but satellite view will come in handy when it comes time to measuring the actual house outline as well as the real-world elements. For now, we'll start with the map view. The first thing you want to do is print a copy of the map view so that you can write your measurements directly on your map. To do this, right-click and it will bring up a submenu where you can select Print. Once you've printed a copy of the map, you want to right-click on the front right corner of our property and select Measure Distance from the submenu. This will create a starting point for the measurement. If the starting point isn't exactly where you want it, click on it and drag it around as needed. Once you have the point set, click on the back right corner of the property to create your second point. Now we have our first measurement. At the bottom of the screen, you can see a box that shows the total distance between the 2 points, but you can also see this total on your map next to your second point. This measurement isn't going to be perfectly accurate as it is just an estimate, so go ahead and round up or down as needed. It's okay if you're off a foot or two in your measurements, as it will be easy to adjust later, but be sure to write down each measurement on the printed map as we go along. Now, if you just go to the next point and click, it's going to give you an accumulative measurement, which is not what we want. So make sure that you're measuring each side of the property. Just click and drag the points to where you need them to measure the second side individually. Once you have the points where you need them, you can see the distance at the bottom of the screen, or again next to the second point in your measurement. Be sure to write down the measurement of each side as you go through them. If you accidentally clear the measurement points, simply right-click and select Measure Distance again to choose new points. Once you have all of the measurements of each side of your property, right-click and in the submenu select Clear Measurement. The next thing we want to do is measure the actual house. To measure the house, we recommend that you switch to the satellite view because the map view has a very simplified shape of the house and it may not be very accurate. To switch to satellite view, click the box in the bottom left-hand corner, then right-click and select Measure Distance. This time, set your first point at the back corner of the house and your second point at the opposite back corner to measure the back side of the house. Continue to measure each side individually and be sure to write down the measurement of each side on your printed base map. Once you've measured each side of the house, the last thing you want to do is determine measurements from the house to the property line or existing elements. If you're measuring from the corner of the house to the property line, it can be tempting to measure from the corner of the house to the corner of the property. The problem with this is that it may not be a straight line, and in this program, we really have no way to determine the correct angle. As a result, the best way to determine these measurements accurately is to go straight from the side of the house to the property line at a 90-degree angle and write that measurement down. Then measure from that point to the corner of the property line and write that down. This will ensure that we have accurate measurements and that we are using the correct angles. To measure existing elements, such as trees, set your first point at the center of the tree, then measure from there to the side of the property. You can then measure from that point to the corner of the property and give yourself a pretty good idea of where that tree sits in relation to the rest of the landscape. In the bottom right-hand corner of the map, there is a view rotation setting which may help you see certain areas or elements better if you rotate your view around. If you have too much tree coverage, this technique may not work well for you, and you may have to do some measuring by hand. But it's still important to ensure you have all your needed measurements on your base map before you start your project. Once you have all of your measurements, you'll need to transfer them to a larger piece of paper so that you have a base map that's large enough to draw on. An easy way to do this is using graph paper and a scale of 1 square equals 1 foot. This is also a great time to make a few copies in case you want to change your plans later. Remember, every good landscape begins with a plan, and every good plan begins with a base map.
Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. Now, I forgot to mention, this class is being recorded and it'll be posted on our website. Usually it takes a couple days for us to get that, formatted and everything and posted. If you want to watch that same video that I just showed you on creating a base map, you can go on YouTube and do a little search for Localscapes base map, and you'll find that same video just independent, that 5-minute video. So if you need that, go online and look for it. So moving on. So once you've created, in the process, I guess, of creating this base map, you're observing and you're noting conditions as well. So you've got your base measurements, it's all to scale. Now you can do this simultaneously. As you're measuring, you can make notes, or you just measure, you draw it all out, and then you need to note where the good views are, bad views, where prevailing winds come from. Some of you may live in those areas where occasionally you get those really strong east winds. Well, it's good to note that, so later on, as you're planning certain things, if you're planning a large evergreen, that may help with wind blockage, but that may also be a problem if the wind is so strong and it blows that evergreen over, it lands on your house. So those are some considerations that you need to be thinking about. It's wind, sun, and shade. The aspect of your house, which way does it face? North, which way is north, which way is south? That's going to help you when you're determining some of these activity zones and other areas where you're actually going to have the hottest spaces in the yard versus the cooler spaces in your yard. One thing that you may not know, but it's good to note, is soil conditions. And if you have funny little pockets of soil, and because in development they're moving soils around, you may know that on the very back part of your property it's a little more sandy, and up close to the house maybe they hauled in some soil, it's a heavier, a little more clay, or vice versa. You can note those things, and slopes, of course. Anything on the landscape that's going to help or influence other things later on, you should make some notes. And as in the video, Cynthia, whose works for Jordan Valley's over some things with this program, you can make multiple copies of this, and they even sell trace paper. Sometimes it's really nice. You have layers where you can layer it right on top of the original plan, and you put another layer that's your observation layer, and then another layer that can be your planting layer, and another layer that's your hardscape layer. And then you can kind of even see through all of those layers, or you simply make multiple copies and you just sketch all these in. Either way, you don't have to worry about formal stuff or being really technical or really artsy or anything else. The idea is that you're just making observations, you're getting this stuff noted. All right, so this is along with those same lines with performing the assessment, your needs. This is where you're starting to think, you're not actually designing this yet. You're not putting these in exact locations. You can put them in general locations, but you're starting to think, what do I need or want in my yard? And this is, do you have a patio that's too small? You want something bigger? You need some privacy because of, your neighbors next door, or just screening because of unwanted views, areas that don't get a lot of use, but you want to get use out of those. You're looking all the site concerns. And in some cases, maybe it's a slope that you don't like it as a slope. So maybe if you're thinking of how can I get a retaining wall in here and make this flat and more usable, those are all things you want to note in your concerns and your wishes. So space for a vegetable garden, space for a shade garden, space for the swing set, or, you know, we're planning to have a few dogs. You know, what kind of space do they need so they're not destroying things that I want, but dogs are going to be active. You know, they need space. A fire pit or family gathering type spaces, or if you entertain, maybe larger patio gathering spaces, or whatever. The sky's the limit on your wish list. It may not all fit, and you may not have the time or budget or anything for it, but you can put all those wishes in a list or on the plan to help you to know what's going to possibly be in your final plan. So then after this, these are all going together with the base map. You finish up your base map. You make sure it's to scale. You note anything that's already there. So as far as like trees, you know, trees that are large and mature, you don't want to be eliminating any of that stuff unless it's simply you don't want it. You can plan to eliminate those things, but your base map should know all the things that are already there that really can't be moved. Anything physically, you know, structurally there, large mature trees, some of those kind of things. Note those, draw them on the plan as your finished base map, and then from there, that's where we're going to move into the transition of, now we're going to start these steps of figuring out where the most logical other spaces fit. And if you're interested in doing the Localscape design class that's going to be coming up, this is one of those prerequisites that helps you understand that. You need to have a base map ready for that class if you're going to join it. We're going to start assuming your base map's done, and we're going to jump right into the design elements from there. So just giving you that little heads up. All right, so let's move on then to the central open shape. And I think Hattie Ann can answer questions. Maybe while I'm here, I'll just answer this one that's in there. Where can you find that large traceable graph paper? Oh, that's a great question. You can find online, if you go to the Localscapes website, go just localscapes.com, you can find a printable large graph paper. Now granted, you're going to need a larger printer, but you can get, there's a little PDF file, there's a file there, and you can print large graph paper. Just look for it on the localscapes.com website. Okay. All right. So central open shape. This is the first part of this, and then we'll transition and we'll just keep working through these principles as we go. I'm going to click back on my presentation here. All right. So notice in this picture, central open shapes, as I mentioned at first, they're primarily lawn, but a central open shape is simply a designed area that's usually flat, open, not planted. It's low to the ground, so it could be ground covers, it could be hardscapes, it could be gravel, it could be grass, it could be grass alternatives, but it's usually a designed element that's what it is. It's open, and it's usually in the front, kind of in the center of the yard. It doesn't have to be. Notice sometimes they're off to the side a little bit. It could be patios like that picture that you're seeing there on the bottom left. And I'll talk about the kind of the reason for these. Central open shapes give the eye a place to rest. It's a design element. Instead of, you've probably all seen this, the kidney bean approach where everything's lawn and then you have an island of planting in the middle. This reverses that. Your central open shapes becomes the island, a larger island in the middle of the rest of the landscape. And it draws your eye, it's flat, and it sometimes gives a focal point to this house. And it's just easier to take care of. When we get to maintenance, we'll talk about the maintenance, we'll talk about irrigation, we'll talk about a lot of things that are real benefits from doing it this way, that really help. And it makes sense just to as far as the other planting and the irrigation and so forth. But you know, open shapes can be different shapes. They can be rectangular, they can be square, they can be kind of oblong or oval, they can be odd shaped, and depending on your lot. And again, the concept is that these just fit, and you create a design space for grass, because that's primarily what ends up in here. If you don't like grass and you want a zero grass landscape, that's great. You can do a central open shape using other things. So the central open shape location, we've already discussed this a little bit. You saw it on the slides. That in this picture, you see it's kind of off a back patio. There's a central open shape there, and there's an extension of it along the side of the house. And maybe they have another little bit in the front with this big patio, fire pit in the middle. Central open shapes can really be anywhere. And again, you're kind of thinking of functionality and as well as design and lower maintenance. You are thinking of how do you use this space. So you're putting these grass areas that are probably going to be played on in areas that are going to get the most use. Ideally, you have a defined edge. Now, notice in this paver picture, the ground covers are they can kind of go over the edge of the pavers a little bit, but usually there is an edge. It's not just a moving edge. You usually have a barrier of some sort. In grass, especially, you have some sort of an edge piece that's easy to contain the lawn from spreading into beds. Keep plants, keep them separate that way and well managed and easy to deal with. And it also, as a design element, it just helps draw the eye and keep things nice, the lines kind of clear and clean. So you kind of have a defined edge. Don't just let the grass roam, or else it will roam and it'll get out of control. And pretty soon you won't have a central open shape. You'll simply have grass everywhere in your planter beds. So a lot of times it's nice to have contrasting or permanent, contrasting and permanent materials next to this central open shape. In the picture on the left there that views some gravel with some concrete edge next to a fence. Their central open shape is rectangular. Notice it's not perfectly rectangular because of it's like a hot tub or something in a corner, but it's a defined edge. It doesn't have obstructions. The other circular type open shape here with the little rocks, it's a little bit less formal, but it still has some contrasting materials, permanent versus non-permanent materials, such as gravel or bark or so forth. They can be, as I mentioned, ground covers, pavers, gravel. There's a lot of materials. Like the picture, the top left with the ground covers, that's different varieties of creeping thyme. They're walkable. You can walk on them. I mean, they're not meant to be played on like grass, but they flower different colors at different times. The foliage is different colors. So you can create a lot of interest and appeal. And most of the other materials that you would use in place of lawn use much less water. And so that's one of the benefits if you simply don't want lawn. Now, many people, a lot of people, they want lawn, and there are some benefits to lawn if it's designed and thought out and you're getting some use. If the only time you ever walk on that is to mow it, then maybe it's a good thing to think about some alternatives to that. But certainly lawn plays a role. So I've already talked about creeping thyme just a little bit, but you want to consider, back to the sun versus shade, putting the right types of plants in the right locations. Now, if you're getting some shade versus sun on a turf, there are turf varieties that are kind of mixed for those part shade and sun locations. And so you still have a healthy lawn in both. But if you had a part shade area or a little bit heavier shade, there's Turkish veronica, or there's other ground cover plants that like those environments and still flowers, still look good, as opposed to full sun. So when we get to plants, that's one of the considerations, is knowing what to put where to meet the site conditions. Now, ideally, in your central open shape is simply large enough to make a bold statement, where it's an anchoring point to the rest of the landscape. So in the case of pavers, a lot of times with pavers, it's kind of viewed as a little bit smaller patio or something. So if you're thinking of pavers, usually a central open shape is larger than just a small patio. It's something that's really defining, really kind of a central anchoring point to the rest of the landscape. So think about that. Gravel, not necessarily as appealing. And notice in this picture, it works as a central open shape, but there's not as much of a defined edge. There are with some of the timbers that are placed in there, but notice the ground covers kind of creeping in. This appeals to many people, and some people can certainly use this and they would love it. That's why we're showing you all these options, because everyone's tastes and preferences are going to be a little bit different. And in areas like this, if you were just to leave it loose gravel, you would then, as we get to maintenance, you'll understand there's things you'd need to do with maybe some pre-emergence, some spot spray with herbicides or hand weeding to make sure and maintain that area so it just doesn't turn into a bunch of weeds unkept. But those are some considerations. Gravel can be done effectively. You can use commercial grade weed barrier under that. It would reduce a lot of weed growth from below. but inevitably wind, birds bring in some seeds and you get some weed growth regardless. All right, so let's focus on lawn for just a second. I showed you a few alternatives. Lawn is really the primary element that's used in our climate. Most people like a little bit of lawn, and it does look nice and it works well. But lawn should be a design element. It shouldn't be the default, okay, I don't have anything else to plant here. I don't know what else to plant here. I'll just put lawn everywhere. The idea with what we're talking about here is lawn can be designed, and when it's designed, it's usually irrigated effectively, it's maintained properly, and it just looks great. And so we'll talk about some of these principles of how lawn can work. Now, there's lots of options even within lawn. You got warm season varieties and cool season varieties. Now, a lot of people think just grass is grass. It's not. There are literally hundreds of varieties of grass within species of grasses. So Kentucky bluegrass, there's hundreds of varieties of Kentucky bluegrass. Tall fescues, lots of varieties. Fine fescues, crested wheatgrass. There's lots of variety with these. So we're kind of saying these as general categories. For the most part though, so you don't have to get too worried about it, most of you will have Kentucky bluegrass with some blend of fescue and perennial rye is kind of the most common that what we see here, Wasatch Front, Wasatch Back areas. Now, some of you have seen, and there's people around that have educated themselves a little bit, and they're growing warm season grasses. This is the buffalo grass, blue grama grass, dog tough grass. These are grasses that thrive in the heat. That's why they're called warm season. How they grow and how they function, they thrive in the heat, but they have a very early dormancy where they go completely brown, and then they come out of dormancy a little bit late. Usually the nighttime temperatures have to get up into the 40s, and it depends on where they are before they'll start greening up. So different ways that these things grow. Cool season grasses thrive in the cooler parts of the year, spring and fall. And in the summer, they want to slow down. We keep them going. We keep them forced green and active by extra irrigation and fertilization and so forth. But natural cool season grasses, they actually shut down and they kind of go into a dormancy period in the summer, and then they green up again in the fall before winter happens. So let's go to, if there's any questions about lawn varieties, ask those in the Q&A box. But we're going to keep going through this. There's a lot to cover with short time. We'll probably go over. Okay, so really quick, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this right now, but for your central open shape, if you're using ground covers or lawn, usually you're going to use overhead sprinkler. You're going to just overhead spray those. They can be done with rotors if the area is large. They can use the rotary nozzles or spray heads, just fixed pop-up sprays, if it's regular turf areas or just ground cover type areas. So notice these little images. These are just types of nozzles. These are types of heads that provide irrigation. The real key to irrigation, and we'll get into depth of that in some different classes in irrigation class, the real key to irrigation is trying to have head-to-head coverage and making sure that you're using the right nozzles to distribute water as evenly as possible. And then it's, of course, making sure you're watering the right amount of time for the nozzle you're using. So there's lots of variables there, but it can be fine-tuned such that you're watering very effectively. You're just basically replacing what is lost through evaporation and transpiration, and you're meeting the needs, and your grass looks great, but you're being very, very efficient with the irrigation you're applying. One other thing about, I already mentioned head-to-head zone coverage. So the spray from one head should reach the spray to another head, but only use one type of head. If your sprinkler system is such you've got all kinds of mixed types of sprinklers and sprays, it's not watering very effectively or efficiently because of the nozzles put out waters at different rates. So ideally you're using one type of spray head with a matched nozzle. Okay, and then that way you're more effectively delivering water to meet the grass needs. If you end up with brown spots in your yard, most likely it's because your sprinklers are simply not covering as they're designed to cover. They're too far apart, the nozzles are not right, there's something going on that's creating a brown spot. Or occasionally funny things happen. I had a weird spot in a yard we previously owned. It would never get green, it was always drying out. So I did a little digging out there, and I found that just below the sod layer, about 2.5 inches down, there was a board left over from construction. So I had this weird shape dead spot. And sure enough, as I dug out an old piece of either roofing subfloor, the OSB type material, it was preventing the roots from getting down deep enough. And so, of course, the heat of the summer, I was getting water on it, but it would just simply dry out. So sometimes you need to dig around. You'll find a giant rock, a piece of concrete, something left over from construction in there. So do some looking before you just crank up the water. All right, so we do recommend rotary nozzles because they slow the rate of application. So that means you'll have less chance that water's flowing or running off of a site, especially if there's a little bit of slope. Slows the rate down, water's able to percolate into the soil a little bit better. The droplet sizes are a little bit bigger, so wind has less of an impact on them. So anyway, that's just one recommendation to improve irrigation efficiency a little bit for you. And then I already mentioned head-to-head coverage. This is just a little illustration. If you look at the lines, the dotted lines and the blue lines, it'll show you the spray pattern, how it should reach from one head to another. And sometimes if you notice that the spray head says it has a radius of 15 feet or 10, let's just use 10, has a radius of 10, a lot of times logically you're thinking, well, this one goes 10, the other one goes 10, so I spread them 20 feet apart. They're not designed that way. If it says 10, that means you need a spray head every 10 feet so that the spray can reach back to the next head. And that's what it means by head-to-head coverage. And if you have an existing system and it's not designed that way, you can improve it, but it requires you digging, finding the pipe, and making those adjustments. It's some work, but to really maximize and make your system more efficient, that's what you should do. So let's move on then to the shapes you should avoid, lawn shapes, and central open shapes. If your yard is really narrow and skinny, we're recommending that you don't have lawn areas less than 8 feet wide. 8 feet wide is kind of the area where you can irrigate it effectively. You start getting less than that, it's more and more difficult to irrigate it effectively. Even if you buy the spray nozzles that say they're meant for strips and narrow spaces, it's just the engineering in those, they've come a long ways, but they're still not great. And it's hard to irrigate those areas effectively, in addition to mowing those areas effectively. So avoid areas less than 8 feet wide, avoid corners less than 90 degrees in angle. So don't have these weird tight corners. It's going to be very difficult to irrigate those effectively and mow them, the maintenance on them and so forth. Architecturally, on a paper, you might think it looks really cool, but when you actually get into maintaining areas like that and irrigating and everything else, it becomes really messy and difficult. The most effective shapes, of course, squares, rectangles, and ovals, gently curved, all those kind of things. So when you're designing when you're thinking about these things, try to do that the best you can. I mean, there are cases where you have to make adjustments. This isn't a rocket science where you have to have everything exact and right on. So just be thinking though, what's most efficient, what's most effective, what meets my needs, but still is easy for me to care for and easy for me to use water and fertilizer and everything else. We suggest that you have lawn that is unobstructed. And notice these little planter islands in the middle of lawn. Now, spray irrigation will hit those just fine. Irrigation will water that the same as the lawn. But what happens is over time, those trees get big, and then you do start to have spray blocked from the sprinklers, and you'll start to see areas that are not getting irrigated as effectively, in addition to just the maintenance. We're trying to help guide you to lower inputs as far as the resources, the water and everything to go into it, in addition to lower time maintaining it. And so if you can leave lawn obstructed and put trees and shrubs and perennials and things on the outside in a well-designed, nicely done way, you can easily take care of lawn without having to worry about running into trees and string trimming rocks. Notice those rocks around the edge with no border. You got to string trim all that every week. We're trying to minimize the maintenance on these things. Here's an example of lawn not less than 8 feet wide. It doesn't really make much sense. That perennial bed could have just extended up to the walkway with some lower growing perennial materials, some ground covers. It's just much easier on the irrigation, on maintenance. So avoid these funny, weird, odd shapes of lawn. Lawn is also not a design, or it's not intended to be a designated path unless it's wider than 8 feet, if you have a big wide path. Otherwise, choose a different path material. And we're going to talk about paths tonight. Choose something a little different that allows you to navigate through your yard, but it's not some crazy weird strip of grass that's hard to water and hard to take care of in the middle of everything else. These are recommendations for how to create a local scape that's going to work to simplify some things for you. Ideally, if you live on a slope, we suggest no lawn on slopes or hillsides. The primary reason is if it's a gradual slope, that's a different thing. But if it's a fairly steep, number one, they're hard to mow. And the other thing is it's very hard to irrigate because the water wants to run down the slope rather than soak into the soil. So irrigation is a challenge, mowing is a challenge. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do on slopes. I mean, you could terrace a slope, you can add lots of perennials, some ground covers. You can have a very attractive looking landscape without having to worry about mowing on a steep hillside like that. So here's you'll see this little model that has been put together throughout that kind of illustrates these principles. You know, in this little illustration here, notice the park strip is done. There's a central open shape that's rectangular. There's some pathways connecting things that go around to the back, around to the sides, as opposed to, you know, there's perennials. Now, this is just simply a computer illustrated thing, right? Of course, not everybody's going to have nice lines and everything perfect, but this is the alternative. And this isn't bad looking. A lot of people love this look. It looks simple. But as far as the resources, the water, the time for grass, the Localscapes concept is reversing the role. It's designing turf and filling plant beds and things around. And your plant beds don't have to be packed full of plants either. They can be sparsely planted, you know, well thought out, just a few plants here and there. But the idea is we're getting away from the sea of grass with a few planter islands, and we're creating island of grass that's large enough to be a nice anchor focal point, and then surrounded by the rest of everything else that's happening in the landscape. So here's the problems. Lawn is a path, lawn in the park strip, odd bits of lawn here and there and wherever. So here's what's showing what you'd do if you had an existing is you're basically carving out an area to keep, and then you eliminate everything else, adjusting irrigation, adjusting your plantings and so forth. And on you go to create a central open shape. So let's talk about how you would achieve this if you already have lawn. Okay, removing lawn, step one. This can be a challenge because, you know, it does require work. It requires a little time. One way to do this though is you decide where, and you can mark this out with paint. Notice the bottom one, you drag a garden hose out there. Something, maybe it's just a string. You can do anything to kind of mark and then visualize, is this what I want? And before you start killing anything or removing anything, do something visually so you can see what will the end result be. Use a garden hose, use something, visualize it, visualize the end result, and then you can go forward with marking it with paint permanently, and then start killing it with the various methods that I'll talk about. So step two is killing the grass. You can use chemical methods, like Roundup or one of those herbicides that you apply, and it kills everything, kills weeds, kills the grass. And notice the look. I had a couple pictures, but I couldn't find them for this presentation tonight, where I've done some of this in my own yard. I measured some stuff out. Excuse me. I measured stuff out. I actually did use Roundup, and I killed the grass, and it looked just like that. It was a straw brown color, had a definite edge between live and dead. If you don't want to use a chemical herbicide, you could use plastic sheeting. Now the picture up above shows it anchored, on the corner. Plastic sheeting, you could cut it to kind of some exact sizes. The thing with plastic sheeting is you're really you're cooking the grass. And use clear because it allows a lot of light in and it heats up the grass, and you're essentially cooking that grass until it dries up and dies. So it takes a bit of time. You need to do it in the warmer parts of the year, so June to August, and you just leave the plastic on there. You anchor it down so the wind can't blow it away, and then you don't water, of course, and your grass slowly just dies. You cook it. Herbicide method, Usually it takes a couple applications. Ideally, I'll tell you how to best do this, is you continue to water, and this doesn't make sense at first, but you'd apply Roundup and then, or whatever chemical you're using, and let it sit, follow the recommendations for when you could apply water next. Continue to water it a couple of times. What that's doing is anything that's remaining alive, it's going to trigger that to grow again quickly. And then you spray it again. And then at that point, you can cut off some water. What usually happens inevitably is you spray it, you think it's dead, and 2 to 3 weeks later, you start to get some growth coming back in because all the roots aren't dead. So usually it applies 2 applications and sometimes 3, and then let it sit for a bit, make sure it's completely dead before you do any removal or, or changing after that point. So this is some of the things you can do to remove sod. You can use a sod cutter and simply cut it out. Now, if you use a sod cutter, there's still going to be a root layer there. So if you use a sod cutter, you may want to till and kind of rake through, and then even then watch and see if you're going to get any regrowth. This picture with the tiller looks like they've killed the grass first and then till it. You don't have to remove all the sod. Once it's dead, that's simply organic matter. It can be cultivated into the existing soil, and you can move the soil around, you can do something. If you don't want to kill the grass and you really want to remove it, there's the shovel method here. You can simply start digging out grass, dig several inches down and start pulling off that grass. If you don't want to haul all that soil and everything to the landfill, put it in an area, turn it upside down so the roots are up, the grass side's down, and let it sit in an area and simply dry out. It'll kill it, and then you've got all that soil available. You can add it back into your beds. Okay, but give it several weeks, a month, or leave it in a corner of your yard somewhere in a pile for a while, and just make sure that all those grass roots are dead before you put them back into your beds. You don't want to be fighting that. Kentucky bluegrass has rhizomes. If you don't get all those dead, a lot of those can grow again, and you'll get grass coming up where you didn't want it. In this picture, once the grass is dead, notice they're moving the sprinkler heads. So in this case, it looks like they've hired somebody to come out and redo. The sprinkler heads were probably up along the sidewalk in the corners. So they're simply moving those heads to the locations that are needed in this area to keep this well irrigated. So for central open shape, I've kind of covered, now we're going through this really fast, covering a lot of material. That's what this is, university, because you're going to get all kinds of information and detail, not to the full extent. I mean, we could take days talking if we get all into depth of irrigation and all kinds of stuff, but this should give you a really good overview, enough depth to be able to understand what we need here with a central open shape portion. So if there's any questions, let's go ahead with questions here, and Hattie Ann's going to load up the next section, and then she's going to take it away on the next section.
All right.
I guess nobody has any more questions about central open shape. So Hattie Ann, whenever you're ready, go ahead, move on to the next section. I'll stop sharing this and you can load up the next one.
Okay. Let's find the right one. Okay. Here we go. We did have one question come in. They're asking, is it best to dig a trench before killing the grass?
Yeah, I'll just answer that rather than typing that answer for Kirsten. Not necessarily. Sometimes it's best just to kill everything off, and then you can move things and dig trenches that you need. If it's moving irrigation, then you're not worried about if you actually killed everything or not. But if you want to go ahead and move heads, which facilitates you killing off grass by just not irrigating it and letting it die, certainly you can dig that trench before you kill the lawn. You can either one, whatever meets your needs the best, go ahead and do that. There's not necessarily one right answer or wrong answer on that one. There is one other question before we move on to the next section. Okay. It says, I live on a hill. I need to know the best materials are for terraces, railroad ties blocks, big hill, 50-foot rights. You know what? I'm going to type an answer into that one since it's a little unrelated to central open shapes. And then Hattie Ann, you can just go ahead. We'll get into a little bit more of the stuff for some of these things as we go. but I'll just type an answer for that one.
Okay, sweet. Alrighty. So the next part of this Localscapes kind of program are your gathering areas, activity zones, and paths. So first we're going to go over your gathering areas. So you've completed your central open shape, right? So we have our front yard example here from our Localscapes 3D model. So that's their Localscapes. Remember, Dave showed you they made that outline of the lawn there. So that's showing it in the front yard, and then it's showing it in the backyard. So central open shape, done. Next, you're going to be going on to your gathering areas and your activity zones. So before you add them, you want to go back to your base map and remember where you were thinking you wanted to put stuff, and then make a list of all the things that you want. So for example, if you're like, I want a fire pit, put that on your list. So gathering areas, like your fire pit, like a bench, a patio type of thing. So making sure that you're making a list of the things that you want there, and then also with your activity areas as well. So make a list of those things that you want to put into your design, and then you're going to be deciding where they're going to fit best. And we're going to be going over those in these next slides. So this kind of goes over it here. So creating functional spaces, right? So you need to make sure that you're thinking about all those different things. So Dave kind of went over this a little bit with looking at your landscape and seeing, okay, what can I see from this view? Do I have nosy neighbors? But do I have a side yard that is kind of wasted space that I can maybe make look beautiful and have it be a really pretty pathway? So making sure that you're looking at all the different areas in your yard when considering your gathering areas and your activity zones is what you're wanting to do before implementing them, right? So first we'll go over gathering areas as a whole. We have a bunch of different examples here. And just a reminder, these slides are going to be available on our website as well. So you'll be able to go back if you want some ideas for your own. This slide, you'll be able to look at this and say, hey, I really actually liked how that one example looked on the slide. So you'll be able to access these afterwards. So with your gathering areas, first you want to think of what they're going to be used for. So gathering areas are supposed to be spaces that are for relaxing or for socializing, right? So make sure that you're making them in the way that fits your needs. There's a bunch of different, see if I can talk right. There's a bunch of different things that work for gathering areas, right? So your patios, your gazebos, fire pits, covered seating, a bunch of different things, right? And you're wanting to be able to think about how you're wanting the gathering area to seem, what you're using it for, and implementing it into your landscape in a way that fits that kind of vision, right? So when thinking about the location, for example, if you have a certain purpose for that gathering area, you want it to be in a certain spot. So for example, if you want an area to seem like an extension of your home, right? So usually patios are seen as an extension of your home. So you're wanting that to be a little bit closer to the house. You're wanting it to be easily accessible, maybe so that you can bring dinner outside and eat on a table on your patio for dinner one night, right? Or for example, if you want a fire pit, you may not want that to be so close to your house because of the smoke, or that it might be like loud next to your house. And then also keep in mind where it is in consideration to your neighbors. So having it in a spot that's not too close to your neighbors, so you're not being loud for your neighbors, but also that it's not too close to your house so that somebody in the house can be not being bothered by the noise either, right? So just kind of considering what the purpose of the gathering area is really going to determine where you're going to put it in your landscape. Also sun exposure. So, I mean, if it's a spot that you're wanting to sit and relax and try to have like a nice relaxing time, usually that's not out in the sunlight for like a long time. There are people that like to sunbathe. So maybe you have a gathering area that's meant for sunbathing, and that's in full sunlight. But if you're wanting a kind of just a cozy spot to sit outside and read, maybe it's more underneath the shade of a tree. So considering that sun exposure is something that will determine where it's going to be. Also, so the trees in the area also kind of go into that. But then they also can, let's see, let me find my notes. Oh yeah, also, but with the trees also is thinking about the maintenance that might be needed to be able to maintain the gathering area and the tree. Like, for example, my parents have a fire pit. There's a tree right above the fire pit. And during the summer, the leaves just above the fire pit, they always end up falling early because the fire warms up that spot. And so it ends up like making the tree think that it's later in the season than it actually is. So just kind of keeping those kind of things in mind. But then as far as like privacy too, like we said with the neighbors thing, if you have a hot tub and you don't want your neighbors to be seeing you relaxing in the hot tub, maybe creating trees around that area or putting it in a different area that people aren't going to be seeing you. And then noise as well. It depends on where you live, but if you live on a really busy street, probably not wanting like a really relaxing area to be by a noisy street, right? So just having kind of all those considerations in your mind when you're thinking about the different gathering areas that you're wanting to put into your yard. And then as far as location goes, there's a bunch of different places you can put it. The front yard, backyard, you can have like main patio type of deal, or you can have a kind of bonus patio off on the side of your house, or a little bench. There's a lot of different places that you can have it. One thing is that if you think about your yard and there's not a place, or there's a place that's not really being used for anything, maybe you can put a gathering area in that space. So from our 3D model, we have that kind of strip of area in between like a fence and the house. And it's an area that's not going to be getting like a ton of sunlight. Not people are going to be using it a lot. So maybe putting a gathering area in that little spot that's going to be really private and really quiet and nice and shaded. So just thinking about your own landscape and thinking about maybe areas that aren't normally used, and if a gathering area is going to be a good use for those areas, right? All right, so next we want to talk about materials. So we know that your gathering areas you're not going to have on the lawn, so they're separate than your lawn areas. But then we also want to think about the things that are going to be going into your gathering areas. So you can do, there's a lot of like the material stuff that you can do on your own, but then there is some stuff that you may want to consider having like a contractor come and install it instead. We'll talk about those different materials coming up. One thing to consider with doing materials is how much is being used and whether or not it's going to be worth it to put in pavers if that area is not going to be used a ton, right? And then availability of material is something that's going to be a big factor in what you decide to use in your areas, and then also your budget. So kind of considering all those things in what materials you're choosing. So a good practice to do or to have in mind is that your gravel, your flagstone, and kind of your looser materials are going to be used for areas that are a little bit more informal. So you're not going to be moving stuff around a ton. It's not really a main gathering area. still used, but it's not like you're going to be moving chairs in and out all the time, and you have a lot of people around it all the time. So kind of it says on here, your informal areas, I suppose, which is a really good description just because it's your areas that aren't used a ton. You can put gravel in those areas because it's a little bit easier as far as like moving chairs and tables and things. And then in your main gathering areas, you want to use more of like a flat, even surface, especially for chairs. So chairs with 4 legs do tend to sink into things that are a little bit more soft. So sometimes, like even with gravel, it can become pretty soft. So if you have like 4-legged chairs out on gravel, they can start sinking into the gravel or get wobbly and things. So just kind of keeping that in mind. So different materials that we have here. So we have like flagstone chips, and that would also go in line with gravel a little bit. Flagstone chips are a little bit different because they do compact a little bit easier. But I probably still wouldn't use them in like a main gathering area. And as far as flagstone chips, they're really easily available, which makes it nice because it can be a really easy, like do-it-yourself kind of project, right? Concrete's really good for those main areas. It's smooth. The only thing about concrete is that depending on the year, it can be pretty expensive. And unless you have the materials for it, you're usually having to hire somebody to come and install it. My dad, he actually has a cement, like a smaller cement mixer. So it's funny because we've always, for all the projects that we've ever done at my house, we've always had our own concrete mixer. So when I was going through these slides and some of the notes were like, you might need to hire someone, I was like, why would they need to hire somebody if they have a mixer? But not everyone has a mixer. So concrete can be a little bit more on the expensive side depending on the year, but then usually you're going to have somebody come and install it as well. Flagstone is good for DIY project as well. It comes in a variety of colors and sizes, which is nice. It kind of creates that variety. Stamped concrete is pretty cool because, I mean, again, the price will depend on the year, but it's cool because you can do different shapes and things. And then it also comes in a variety of colors, which normal concrete does also. So you can have different colored concrete and then have it seem kind of like a paver shape, but then it's not pavers, it's concrete. So that's a fun option. And then pavers, you can install them yourself, and then they also can be professionally installed. I do know that it's a little bit of a process to install your own pavers. It takes like specific material underneath, and then putting the pavers all in its pattern, and then you have to put like sand in between. And so it's a little bit of a process doing it yourself, but it can help cut down the cost a little bit if you're doing it yourself. But pavers are awesome because they come in a variety of colors and different shapes, and then you get to kind of arrange them the way that you want them to look. So pavers are a nice material to be used. And then as far as calculating how much material you're going to need, there's actually a lot of websites and places that you can go that will help you in calculating how much you're going to need. So this one is a good website that you can use, that you can say how big it is and how long the area is, and then it'll tell you how much you go. And it's really nice to have that underneath your belt when you're going to a place to get the material needed, because then you can say, I need this much and this many tons of this specific stuff, and then they'll be able to get it a lot more easily for you. So making sure that you know how much you're going to need, and there's again a lot of good resources that you can go to be able to get help with that. All right, so 3D model, again, we have our gathering areas that they've decided to put in. So we have a patio on the back, and then they've also added a gazebo with a private seating area, which is nice. So that's kind of how it's looking in the backyard. I don't think that they have any gathering areas in the front yard. But those are just a couple of examples put in there. So next are our activity zones. And the thing about activity zones is that there's something that are constantly changing depending on what you're wanting to use your landscape for, right? So, I mean, if you have kids, usually you're going to have a play area in the back, but kids grow up. And so that play area may become something different with time. Maybe a play area can become a chicken coop eventually, or you'll end up putting garden boxes there instead. So just kind of keeping that in mind with kind of evolving type of things. It's a little bit harder to change like where a swimming pool is, but your things like your vegetable gardens and your play areas for your kids and things are probably going to be changing over the years, just depending on what activities you're going to be doing in your own landscapes. So just like the gathering areas are designated spaces for seating, and they're separate from the central open shape, right? No lawn in your gathering areas, just to cut down on maintenance and cut down on the water usage as well. It's just a lot easier to have a gathering area that's on different material than your lawn. The same is for your activity zone. So designated spaces for outdoor work and play. So it's completely separate from your central open shape. I guess is not just lawn, but your central open shape. So activities have their own area, gathering areas have their own spot, and your central open shape has its own spot, right? And there's different types of activity zones, a lot of different ones. So there's your vegetable gardens, your trampolines, hot tubs, storage like containers or sheds. That was the word I was thinking of. Would be considered an activity zone. Other recreational activities out in the yard. So there's a lot of different examples, and we'll be giving some of those, but just those are some examples. But just thinking about what you're wanting to do in your yard is something to think about. Some things to consider because of the different activities that you can put into your yard. You're gonna need to consider a few different things. So for example, like sun exposure, vegetable gardens, if you're wanting a vegetable garden in your yard, vegetable gardens need full sunlight. So that's 6+ hours of sunlight on them. So if you're wanting that, you're gonna have to think, you're gonna look at your plan and say, okay, where is a spot where it's gonna be getting 6+ hours of sunlight? And then that's where your vegetable garden is going to go. So like underneath a tree is not going to work for your vegetable garden, right? Space requirements. How big is your activity zone going to be? So if you have a play area for your kids, you're going to be wanting that area to be big enough to accommodate all the things they're going to be doing. So if there's a slide, you don't want the slide running into a tree or running into a fence. So just making sure that you're keeping the space the size it needs to be for the activity that's going to be done. Kind of the look of it, attractiveness, it says there. So what are you wanting people to see, right? Are you wanting your vegetable gardens in the front yard? It can look cool, but maybe some people wouldn't want that to be something that people see all the time. Again, like your purpose to your activity zone. Needing to monitor an activity away from the house. So having your activity zone maybe in, so if you have a play place for your kids or a sandbox or something, having it be able to be seen outside of a window that you're able to look out frequently is something that you maybe want to have, so you can keep an eye on your kids while they're outside. And then also considering what the ground is going to be like, or what kind of ground cover can you be using, and then also your budget as well. So having all of these things in mind when thinking of your activity zones, right? And also location consideration. So where is it going to be in your yard? We kind of already talked about this, but like with sun exposure, we talked about our vegetable garden, it needs to be in full sun, right? But if you have a play place, slides, for example, get super duper hot in full sunlight. So maybe having your play area underneath the shade of a tree is going to be better. Or like for this example, they have a trampoline underneath the shade of a tree. So just kind of having those in mind for different things. And then also your space requirements. So depending on the location, does that location have the amount of space needed, right? We kind of went through these things already, but just remembering to keep all of those things in mind. And one good thing about activity zones, as well as gathering areas, is they reduce the maintenance. So when you have that designated spot, so this is a bad example. I mean, it looks great, but if you think about the maintenance that's needed for this area, they're having to mow all around all those different things and then take a trimmer and go back and trim around all the different things. It's just a lot of work to do. Whereas if you had that designated spot where it was completely separate from the grass, you wouldn't be having to maintain the grass in the area, then having to worry about areas that aren't being irrigated well because there's a slide in the way, right? So it greatly reduces your maintenance when you have a designated area for your activity zones instead of having it mixed with your lawn. And then as far as surface materials for your activity zones, this is one good thing to consider. It's going to depend on what you're using the activity for. So for example, sand is a good material to use, and it's something that's nice to especially incorporate into like play places for kids, because it just gives another element for something for them to play with, and it's soft, so if they fall on it, it will help to kind of cushion that blow. But then bark mulch is actually something that's a nice one that you see used in a lot of like parks. And then gravel can actually be pretty soft if it's layered thick enough. And there's even some gravel that aren't like those harsher shapes. There's some that are a little bit more smooth. You don't have kind of pokey shapes in your gravel. This example over on the right, I mean, it looks super cool, but you just want to kind of consider the fact that like there's this rock pathway. And if a child were to fall off that ladder and fall into the rock pathway, like that's going to hurt them a lot, right? Whereas if that was sand or some gravel, it might be a little bit more cushioning. So just kind of considering what the activity zone is going to be used for and what material am I going to put in there. So vegetable garden, right? What are you going to be putting if you have raised beds? What are you going to be putting around those raised beds? Are you going to do gravel, bark mulch? Sand probably isn't the best for a vegetable garden area, right? Bark mulch and gravel are going to be nice for you to walk on and low maintenance for all those, especially if you're not watering them, right? So just kind of keeping those in mind. And then most of your activity zones, you're not going to have to be worrying about watering, but with a vegetable garden, that is something that you need to consider water because you're growing plants, right? We do recommend that your vegetable gardens be watered with drip. It's the easiest way to do it. And then to make sure that they're on their own valve, that they're separate from your planting beds and your central open shape watering schedule, just because vegetables, they need to be watered differently than most of your landscape plants and your lawn, right? So make sure they're on their own valve. And then drip irrigation, we do recommend just because that's an easy way to get water kind of distributed more evenly without doing spray irrigation. Let me see here. Make sure. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, also with the irrigation, I'm going to go back. So another good thing about this is with that drip irrigation, because we're kind of putting a little bit more sourced onto the plant, it reduces that maintenance too. So I mean, there's going to be a little bit of like your weeding and typical kind of stuff, but if we're doing that drip irrigation, that's really helping with keeping weeding down, and then also with water efficiency. So it's a lot more water efficient to be doing it with drip just because you're not spraying areas that don't need water. You're doing it pretty directly onto the plants, right? Okay, wonderful. We kind of went over this already, but the adaptability part of your activity zones, again, is just something to consider. So like we were saying here, they had a play set for their children, but when the children grow up, what are they going to do? They can get rid of the play set and convert it into a fire pit area, right? So kind of keeping those things in mind as you're creating your activity zones. So here we have our 3D model. We have our patio and our gazebo, and now they've added your children's play area and the vegetable garden. So there's that example there. And so these next pictures are some things that actually Dave did in his backyard. And they're just for some ideas. And these were all things that he did himself too. So it's just nice to show just some of the different things that you can be doing in your yard to help like keep your kids entertained and to give them space where they can play and have fun. So, I mean, he created this sand area over on the left. I think it's left for you as well. And that kind of flagstone look, he actually, it's pieces of concrete that he took out of another area. So kind of reusing materials is something that may help with like a budget type of thing. You can do reuse concrete. There is a place where you can get like pre-used brick and things too. So that can kind of help with budget type of things. But he just used that concrete to kind of create those pathways and then created that sand area for the kids. And then on the right side, this is something that he did for his kids, was creating a little fairy garden area because his kids played outside. And then it's a way to like help them have fun while they're weeding areas, because not only are they weeding, but they're taking care of their own little like garden, right? So these are some really fun ideas for activity zones. And then this is something else that he also did, was converting his backyard, since it wasn't really being used for the grass, that he converted it into more of a golf course. So that's all artificial turf being used there. And it's something super fun for his family to be able to use and have their friends come over and even use. And I mean, it's unique. It looks super fun, and I mean, he says in what he has told me is that it was not the easiest to install, but he did it himself. And I mean, it created a really fun activity for him and his family to be able to enjoy. And then this is an example of fire pit area, and it's during the process. So it's been converted into like this nice area, right? And it kind of is showing how it looks during the process. And then I believe that was in his yard as well. I'm not completely sure, but I know that most of these pictures are from his yard. Because this, yeah, it is, Dave. Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I could jump in. Yeah, these are all from my yard. Now, these are a few years ago. I should add updated pictures of these because the landscape has grown in a little bit. But yeah, these are all things that I've done. Of course, I'm trying to make activity zones and reduce some turf and do some fun things. I mean, my kids are growing up all through this process too. So I only have daughters, hence the fairy gardens, but they've kind of grown out of that a little bit. They're not nearly as eager to go play the fairies, you know, when they're 17 years old or whatever. But yeah, these are all fun things that they took a little time, but they've been really fun. And even when the kids, before the COVID adventures, you know, they'd have friends over all the time and really enjoying these spaces. So to me, they've been very worth it. And I didn't invest a lot of money. I invested a lot of time to make these happen.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and it's completely unique too. So that's a fun part to say, like who has a checkerboard in their backyard? Dave does, because it was a fun activity zone area that he thought of for his yard. So you can make these activity zones pretty unique to what you're wanting to do. And there's a lot of fun ideas out there. And then, so the next thing, so we have gathering areas, activity zones, now pathways. Pathways are pretty simple. They're used to connect all of your areas together, right? And there's a lot of different materials that you can use for them. And it also depends on what they're being used for, is what the different materials are going to be used as well. So yeah, pathways connect the landscape elements together. They help you navigate your landscape easier. As far as locations go, you can have them on the sides of your house. You can have them from your driveway to your front door, from the sidewalk to the front door, from your driveway to your backyard type of thing. Even through your park strip area. Sometimes it's even nice to have a pathway through there, just so that people have a pathway instead of them trampling all over your park strip. There's one already made so that it's more of a designated pathway, right? And then depending on where it is will depend on if it's a primary path or a secondary path. So primary paths are those paths that are used a lot more frequently. So usually it's your pathway from like to your front door. So either sidewalk to the front door, driveway to the front door. And then your secondary paths are like the things, or the pathways that are connecting things in your landscape together. So like front yard to backyard, your central open shape to your vegetable garden, or your patio to your trampoline or something. Secondary path is just a pathway connecting more of like your landscape elements, and your primary path is connecting to those main areas that are used a lot more often. So for your primary path, you want to use materials that are a little bit more smooth. And so it's going to be like your concrete, your pavers, stamped concrete, and brick. You want them to be ideally materials that can be easily like shoveled the snow off of, right? That's what I think of. Just where we're in Utah, your primary paths are the ones that you're shoveling or that you're plowing most often. And so if you have gravel on your primary paths, you're going to be digging up your gravel, right? Or pushing it around, and that's not ideal. So you want to make sure for your primary paths that you're choosing a material that's a little bit more durable, and that you're going to be able to easily shovel off if the needs be, right? And then your secondary path materials can be like your bark or your flagstone chips or your gravel or your big flagstone chunks. So they're a little bit less informal, I guess. The other ones are more of a formal look, and this is more informal. It also helps kind of with the when like someone is looking at your landscape, it helps them say like, oh, that looks like a pretty main path. And then you have gravel paths on the side. So they're a little bit more of like not your main pathway. So it's good to have a distinction between the two, just for a design element as well. So in creating your pathway, there's a little bit of a process. So you want to think about how thick it's going to be. So if your gravel, if you do gravel or your flagstone chips or your mulch, you do want to do, there we go. You want to do 2 to 3 inches of that kind of stuff. So if you're doing 2 to 3 inches of that, you want to take 2 to 3 inches of your soil out, right? So create your pathway, decide how wide you want it to be. Typically pathways are 3 feet wide. Main pathways are sometimes up to 4 feet, but your secondary pathways can be a little bit smaller. So, but designate your width, and then you're gonna dig out your path. So take the soil out, and then you can put weed barrier fabric actually in this kind of in this instance is the word I'm thinking of, is actually a good idea, just because it does help in keeping weeds down from underneath. Again, Dave said this earlier, but birds are going to bring seeds, wind is going to bring seeds, so then the weeds will go on top of that weed barrier fabric, right? But at least you'll have that barrier from the ground underneath, and then you're not going to have to worry about compaction with that weed barrier fabric, because that area is for a pathway, not for plants, right? So putting down your weed barrier fabric or landscape fabric, and then you can put your edging. It's really nice to have that edging to kind of distinct the two, like your distinction between your pathway and your plant bed. And then putting the stuff on top. So that's kind of the process that you would go through with pathways. And then this is just re-edifying that the edging is nice because it does help kind of create that pathway. So now we have our 3D area. This is the front yard. So we have our central open shape, and then you can see all the pathways that they have connecting. So they have one connecting to the backyard on the left side, they have one connecting to the shed, and then the rest of the backyard, and then even a little pathway connecting from the central open shape to the main pathway to the door. And then in the backyard, we see all of our pathways going from front yard to backyard, and then our little like flagstone areas going through our plant beds, getting to our central open shape, right? So again, pathways are just connecting those elements together. And if there's any questions about pathways or materials used or gathering areas or activity zones, this is the time to ask them. And if we don't have any questions, then we'll have Dave go on to the next part.
So there's no questions in the Q&A box yet, but it looks like Nancy, you have raised your hand. If you will, rather than raise your hand for a question, if you still have that question, type your question in the Q&A box. We can address that. And yeah, sorry, it's just the way we do it on these webinars. So please, if you have questions at this point, certainly go ahead and ask them. I'll start bringing up my next section here.
Perfect. I'll stop my share. It'll be easier. Perfect.
Okay. I guess if there's questions, Hattie Ann will address those as they come in. We'll go ahead and move on. We've got quite a bit more to cover. Now, I'm going into the maintenance bit. So we've covered some things. I'm going to talk about maintenance, and then we're going to get to planting beds. Now, we kind of throw maintenance in here in the middle because it encompasses everything. And it's actually a really important thing to have to be successful in your yard is how to maintain this and keep it well maintained. So we'll just go through some of the maintenance things, then we'll get into the planting section, and then we'll wrap up with any questions and answers at the end. So tree maintenance is a big deal. You know, trees are a big investment. Number one, you're spending a lot of money to put them in, but as they grow, they really increase the value of a property, and the tree itself has a high value as they mature. They're big, they shade, they do a lot of different things for a landscape. So maintain those things. Get out and prune the dead, disease, crossing branches. We've had some pruning classes. If you're unsure how to do that, review some of the pruning classes we've done. Ornamental trees are very different than fruit trees. Fruit trees, you're interested in production, so it's a very different method, but prune out the trees and keep them healthy, keep branch structures good so you don't have big branches breaking out. And of course, choose the right tree for the right space so you can really have what you want in a landscape. You're getting the benefits if it's evergreen, if it's deciduous, and do those things to keep your landscape at a high value and keep it looking really good. During dry winters, or in the first 2 years of establishment, extra water may be needed for root systems that are still developing. Now, a dry winter means we're getting almost zero precipitation. We go through these periods, even this year, January was kind of a dry month where we'd normally be snowing, and it was, there can be some things. Sometimes our trees, especially if they're young and not matured, you may need to haul a bucket of water out there because you don't have irrigation water, your hoses are put away. Haul a bucket of water, 5 gallons of water out there and 10 gallons of water or something, and dump it around that tree and let it soak into the ground. It'll take a little more time if the ground's a little bit frozen, but it'll get that water in there and keep those trees healthy through the winter. Shrub maintenance. This is, shrubs are a little different game. Some of them can be pruned all the way down. Some of them you don't want to do that. You'll kill them. Again, back to the pruning class references, but you can always remove dead branches. Any time of year there's a dead branch, you can take that dead branch out. You don't have to wait for any specific time. You can remove branches that are going out into sidewalk spaces, branches that are rubbing up against the house and structure, any undesirable areas, cut off dead flowers, even for lilacs and those blooming things. You can cut those off anytime, but that just helps keep a shrub healthy. It keeps it invigorated. It keeps things growing, keeps your landscape looking nice and just well kept. So now, one thing that was mentioned in our pruning class, know when to prune certain things. Some shrubs you prune after they flower in the spring. Others you want to prune in dormancy before they even start budding out in the spring. So knowing the difference, you'll be very successful. Your shrubs will look great. They'll flower great if they're flowering. And so do a little homework, review some of our previous classes, ask us some questions if you have questions about those things. Now, ornamental grasses. We love ornamental grasses. If you'll come to our learning garden, it's open to the public. Once these get going, they're good structural things in a landscape. They're very low maintenance, they're low water, and there's a range of ornamental grasses from as high as 6 feet tall and taller down to your short little 18 inches, even shorter, even a foot tall little ornamental grasses. And they're great. Typical grasses need to be just cut back once a year. Now this says leaving 18 inches of plant above the ground. That is not correct. You cut, depending on the grass, the majority of the grasses, everything above the ground is dead material. The crown of the plant is active and it's down low to the ground. You can cut it as close to the ground as possible. Don't leave a funny stub. All that's dead and it's going to look dead next year. So now if your grasses are still up, you can cut them now in the spring. Some people cut them in the fall. Once they've gone brown, they've gone dormant, they'll cut them completely down because then they don't have to deal with that mess in the spring. But cut them right down to the ground. Now there's a few exceptions. Your Carl Forester grasses and your blue oak grasses, they're semi-evergreen. So you don't need to necessarily cut all the way down in. You can kind of rake through. You can cut the tops, the dead seed heads and stuff off, and then take a little rake, metal something, and just rake through it. It'll rake out any dead. And if it needs tidy, you trim it up a little, but they don't necessarily need to be cut all the way to the ground. If the plant gets too big on ornamental grasses, divide it into sections, dig it up, divide it, put one of your plants back in the ground and give your others away or compost them or throw them away. Over time, the mass will grow wide. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it'll start to crowd in the middle and start to die in the middle. If you're seeing that on your ornamental grasses, it means they need division. Dig up, start chopping off edges of that, dig up the whole thing, take one chunk, put it back for you. It reinvigorates, it re-enlivens this thing, and it'll get it healthy again. And just a year, it'll be back to normal size, back to big. Okay, so if you have questions about ornamental grasses, let us know on those. Perennial plant maintenance. Typically, most perennials are herbaceous, and so what will happen is they'll grow from a crown and they'll grow up, they'll flower, they'll do their thing multiple times through the year sometimes, and then in the winter they'll die down. Some of them die completely, you won't see anything alive, and others die down to kind of a floret of leaves. It's down to a basal area. And so using some hand pruners, sometimes even your hands, just to pinch off and break off, you can just go and cut all that dead material back, and you leave just a couple inches. Again, if it's dead, you can cut it all the way down to where it's not dead anymore. And if there's a little floret base of flowers down there, you don't necessarily need to cut into not flowers, leaves. You don't need to cut into that. But in this picture is a great example. Cut those dead stems all the way down as low as you can go. Most perennials you can cut them in the fall or the spring. There are a few that are actually a little bit sensitive. You would want to wait and cut them in the spring. But because the list is so huge on perennials, do a little homework. You can do some internet searches. There's really, the most done in the fall. But a lot of times you're done with landscapes in the fall. You just want to put it to bed, and then you're excited in the spring to get out and clean it up. That's just fine. You could wait for almost all of it. The downside is snow sometimes matches everything flat. You have to kind of do a little raking to clean up. But it's easy to do that. So early spring is a great time. Fall is a great time. In the summer, you don't need to do a whole lot of maintenance other than cutting off dead flowers or dead stems. They call it dead heading. On some perennials, that really reinvigorates them, and you'll get a second flush of flowers. May nightshade is an example. Once it's spent flowers, you go in and cut those spent flowers out, the stems down a little bit, cut all that out. it'll re-stimulate new growth and new flowering, and it'll go again. Now think of, most perennials want to set seed. So if you cut off the flowers, the dead flowers that are going to produce those seeds, the plant is triggered into, oh no, I need to set seed. And so it flowers again. Not all of them do that, but a lot of them do. And so if you stay on top of that deadheading, you'll get reinvigorated and extended bloom times multiple times through the growing season for a lot of perennial plants. So general planting bed maintenance is, of course, we want you to water with drip irrigation. It's super effective. It delivers water where you need it without watering everything else, without spray head blockage. In the case you're using secondary water, if you want to use drip, and we recommend it, just get a good filter. And so you're not going to be plugging up your drip emitters with any debris that's in secondary water. Secondary water is not screened. It's screened to 1/4 of an inch is all at delivery. And then there can be small debris in there, small crustaceans in there. There's all kinds of stuff. So get a good filter on your own system. You can deliver water very effectively to your flower beds, save a lot of water, and have great beds, no spray blockage or anything. Ideally, you're applying 3 to 4 inches of mulch. Now this mulch can be wood chips. It can be, composted material. Sometimes people like to buy that composted material from the landfill and use that as mulch. That's great. It could be rock. There's lots of different colors of rock product that are used as mulches. Mulches do a couple things. It helps keep a barrier between soil and air. And so you're reducing evaporation from the soil. It actually moderates soil temperatures. Even if it's rock, funny enough, rock heats up, but it's still moderating soil temperatures. So that does some things for plant growth and plant roots. In addition to weeds, it reduces weed germination and some different things. And depending on the product, we've seen in certain areas, rock mulches in certain instances can actually increase a little bit of germination because it heats up early, but then it helps later on in the season for different weeds. So there's some pros and cons to different materials, but either way, use a mulch. It'll help reduce weeds. It'll help keep the soils moderated and water loss. If you avoid soil compaction, meaning that's why pathways. You create pathways where you're going to have a path, and then you're not really walking through your beds continually. Other than that, occasionally you're walking through to weed, and that reduces soil compaction. It'll keep your soils healthy, and that's the purpose of the pathways, just to really help with that. And then, if you can, it says minimize soil disruption, meaning once you've got a perennial bed or flower bed established, you don't need to be cultivating and tilling that bed all the time. Now you can, but every time you disturb soil, you got to remember there's a seed source there. And if the conditions are just right, the seeds will germinate. And so this happens when you till your vegetable garden. It happens when you till anything. You're creating a new environment for some seeds that may have been buried before, and now they're closer to the surface. Now the conditions are right to germinate. So anytime you minimize soil, you will get some new seed growth and some weed growth. And then, of course, use herbicides only after you've done everything else of these other steps. Herbicides have a place in a landscape. They have a functional place. I am by no means opposed to herbicides, but it's always using herbicides properly. You're using the thing for the right application in the right amounts, following instructions. And if you're doing other things correctly, a lot of times there's no need for those chemical applications of anything because you just don't need them. Everything's under control. You get a balance going on, a little bit of hand weeding here and there, and you're really, really good after that. Initially, I will suggest, when you first disturb all the soil and you're planting something new, if you're doing this, sometimes a pre-emergent, that first or second year really helps because the weed seeds will germinate. Pre-emergent will kill those little seedlings, and then it reduces the next year's seed load, which then, of course, if you can get that under control the first or second year, from there on out, you have weeds, but the number of weeds is dramatically reduced. Okay, moving on to planting bed maintenance. I've already talked a little bit about pre-emergent. Post-emergent herbicide means the weed is already up and already growing, and you're trying to kill it after the fact. Glyphosate is the ingredient in Roundup, and it's used in Killzall and those kind of herbicides that are not selective. In other words, they will kill everything. So if you spray it on a weed and you spray it on your perennial, it'll kill both. So be careful with post-emergent herbicides. They're meant to kill plants. For the most part, and some people are very concerned about this. You've seen lots of ads, and these cause cancer. They do all kinds of things. There's some documentation through the land grant university, Utah State University, that shows some of the studies done with these. It does not have a residual in the soil. So some people say, well, if I spray weeds, I'm not going to be able to plant anything. That is not true. They don't have a residual that affects transplants and different things as you put them back in the soil. It's usually once they get on foliage, they affect the growth and they kill the plant through absorption through the foliage and down. But if you're concerned about that, do a little bit of research and make your own decisions. There are some organic methods for doing things. My experience with weed control is those organic methods are sometimes less effective. It depends on the weed. It depends on some circumstances. But hand pulling is always an effective way. I've done a lot of hand pulling, and once you get that initial weed growth under control, you can spend 15 minutes a week in your yard and just do a walkthrough with a hand digger, and you can pop out all the weeds, and in 15 minutes you could have walked through everything and you're done in all your beds. And I mean that in our learning garden, we have areas like that, relatively low maintenance. Of course, there's always going to be some weeds coming in. You can be the most effective at all kinds of methods, and you're still going to have a weed here and there just because of wind and everything else that brings weeds. But if you stay on top of it, it'll be way reduced. You'll be very happy. You'll be not spending as much time weeding. You'll just be enjoying your yard. We do suggest sometimes in beds, skip the weed barrier. Look what happens here. The roots actually of your desired plants end up just growing into the weed barrier, sometimes on top of the weed barrier, creating unhealthy, desirable plants, and weeds still grow on top of the weed barrier anyway. So in planting beds, a lot of times we just suggest keep on top of the weeds, a nice layer of mulch, and you get that balance over the first couple of years. You won't need a weed barrier. Under rock mulch with very few plants, a weed barrier has a better application. But if you're just going to be cutting holes in it and you're going to plant plants everywhere, and then one plant dies over here and you add another and you're cutting holes in it anyway, sometimes it's, in my experience, in my opinion, it's a kind of a waste of money. And then you end up fighting it down the road because your mulch breaks down. You end up creating a very fertile layer on top of that fabric anyway, unless it's a rock material in there, that's reduced significantly. So anyway, just watch your use of weed barrier fabrics in heavily, a densely planted flower bed. Lawn maintenance, this is something that most people just think they know and understand, and for the most part you do, right? You have a lawnmower, you mow it once a week or twice a week, and you set your lawnmower and you just do it. There is a little more to lawn maintenance than most people think about that'll help create healthy lawns, deep-rooted lawns. Ideally, if you set your lawn at the highest height, 3 inches or higher. Now, granted, it seems a little long, but if you'll do that, your lawn will actually be healthier. It shades the soil better. The more photosynthetic material on top actually equates to a deeper, healthier root zone below. And every time you mow your lawn, you're actually stressing lawn. It's cutting it off. The lawn has to heal that end of every blade. And if you have a dull lawnmower, it's even worse. But so ideally, you want to mow frequently enough. You're not cutting off more than a third of the grass at a time. So you won't want to let it grow really long and then cut it. That's really stressful on lawns, and it's not as good. But a taller lawn means deeper roots. So set it high. Deeper roots help deal with drought longer. And then ideally, if you have a mulching mower, just let the mulch go back in. The clippings can go back in. If you're cutting too much off it when you do that, then it just leaves clumps of clippings everywhere. And it's unsightly. They dry out. It looks ugly. But if you're mowing appropriately, those mulch clippings can go back in, and they're a source of nitrogen. They build the soil. They're adding organic matter, and they do not add to thatch. Thatch is actually a buildup of roots, shallow roots, usually caused by overwatering and compaction. So your clippings on a lawn will not contribute to thatch. Okay. Mow height. Here's just a couple. This is actually a neighbor side by side. One's shorter, one's longer. Now, granted, you might say, well, one just barely mowed and one didn't, and that could be the case. But typically, when you leave lawn a little higher, it looks a little better. It stresses less when there is irrigation issues. When you have some patches that are not getting quite the coverage, The shorter lawns will dry out more quickly and turn to have the brown spots. In this case, both lawns receive similar amounts of water, but were mowed differently. This picture actually came out of South Dakota University, State University. So there are studies on this. There's been a lot of research done on turf management, and especially golf. The golf industry has actually led to a lot of those studies. And so I guess everyone can benefit from the research that's done through the golf industry on how to maintain and keep lawns looking their best with the least amount of inputs and maintenance cost and time. We've already talked about this. Short lawn allows more sunlight, therefore weeds. You notice this picture, you see field bindweed in this lawn. There can be real problems. If you end up with a lot of field bindweed or Bermuda grass and some of those real perpetual hard to get rid of weeds, once they're in there, they're kind of challenging to get rid of. And there's not organic methods for those. You really have to just look for selective. In that case, you're looking at broadleaf weed control. And then there are a few very selective herbicides for Bermuda grass. If followed well, if you follow them as instructed on the instructions, you can manage these weeds. And it takes sometimes a few years to several years to get those under control and get your lawn healthy enough to where it outcompetes those weeds, and then you're good. But if you have that situation, don't think in one season it's going to be an easy fix unless you're really, really committed and really on it as far as timings and the selective herbicides that you're going to use to get those under control. If you have clover in your lawn, some people don't mind that. That's a personal preference. Clovers actually do fix nitrogen. They'll take nitrogen from the air and they fix it into the roots, and so they're adding a little bit of nitrogen to the soil. But if that bugs you, again, you're going to have to use a broadleaf weed control for those. And we suggest always use chemicals sparingly, and try to time it appropriately, so you're not just spraying and there's already seed set, so next year you're fighting the same issue over and over and over. If you get the timing right on these, you eliminate a whole nother year of seed source that you're going to have to fight the following year. And go to some nurseries, talk to some people that understand weeds. There are some places, if you big box stores, nothing against them, but if you're asking the person, the person in Home Depot or Lowe's garden center about this, they may or may not know. But if you go to a specific place where they deal with chemicals, especially Steve Regan in Salt Lake, there's IFA stores, or, Cal Ranch stores, some of those, they have Dallas Greens, they have specific people that understand and have a lot of training on herbicides and timings. Even nurseries, go to nurseries, a lot of their staff will know. So just watch those things. Lawn edges, try not to scalp or bevel the edges. It leads to unhealthy and just burnt edges a lot of times. Ideally, you're using an edger like this that cuts a nice clean edge and reduces the problems of that angle. And again, it's anytime the lawn is super short and super, and when you string trim it, you're cutting it really, really short down to the roots almost. It stresses, and so naturally it turns brown, or you have to use a lot of water to keep it green. This kind of edger is cutting more up and down instead of sideways, scalping the grass off. It makes a nice clean edge, keeping that edge healthy and looking good. And then aeration. Do a core aeration on your lawn if it's compacted. If you have a sandy, looser soil, usually you don't need to worry about aeration. Aeration helps to reduce thatch and helps with compacted, heavy soils. So if you have a clay soil, you can aerate twice a year if you really want. You can do it spring and fall. You could even do it in the summer. Most people do it in spring and fall because it is pulling. Ideally, you're pulling a core out of the ground. It pulls that core, those little plugs, and you don't have to rake them up. Leave them on the ground. It's soil and root material. It'll just break down and it'll go back in. But it improves water movement, air movement, and again, at least once a year on compacted soils. And spring can be the most beneficial time, although you can do these and you can do it in the fall as well. Most people just don't do it in the summer. Summer, there's heat stress. There's a lot of other factors going on. That's why you usually avoid a lot of this kind of stuff in the summer. You don't want to add extra stresses and different things. Quickly, fertilizer. On a bag of fertilizer, there's 3 numbers: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, in that order. Usually for lawn, you're really only worried about the first number. Our soils here in Utah typically have enough phosphorus and potassium, although if you really wanted to know that, you could get a soil test done. But nitrogen is the one that's easily leached out of soil or washed out of soil with irrigation, and it's depleted. So if you are just struggling with green, a nitrogen fertilizer, a high number at the first and then zero followed by 00, like a 2100, 1600, 4600, that's just the percent nitrogen you're adding. And be careful, because nitrogen can also burn your lawn. But you add that fertilizer, nitrogen will help green things up. It's necessary for healthy, dense green lawn. Potassium and phosphorus help for root development, drought stress, different things. That's what I mean. A lot of those things are, the potassium and phosphorus is already in the soil. We usually lack nitrogen. So the best thing, I think this next slide, yeah, it is. This next slide talks about the scheduling. Ideally, you're fertilizing probably 3 times a year. But if you don't, and honestly, I don't, I'll fertilize twice a year on my own yard, because I'm not super worried about it in the summer. I actually want it to slow down growth in the summer. I don't love to mow the grass in July when it's 100 degrees outside. So it'll naturally slow down. So I fertilize in the spring, greens it up, it's all healthy. It'll slow down naturally in the growth, and then I fertilize again in the fall. But ideally, if you only fertilize once, your most important fertilizers in the fall. Do it in September to October, apply it. It will put the nutrients in the soil. So in the spring, it'll be ready to go, ready to grow. You'll have a nice greened up, early greening, depending on the variety of grass you have. And the variety does make a difference on when they come active and green up. But ideally, that's your most important fertilizer. And then some of you, if you want to follow that fertilizer schedule, the IFA 4-step or the J&J 4-step or whatever, you can do those things. It's just fine. Some of them come with pre-emergence or herbicides already in, and you can follow their steps. There's nothing wrong with those, but some of them aren't necessary. And if a company's calling you up and saying, I need, you need a fertilizer every single month, you don't need it every month. Of course, extra nitrogen is going to increase the growth rate. It'll grow faster. It'll be dark green. So, it's up to you on time and money, but we don't necessarily recommend that. Here's the schedule you could follow to be successful. Now, as we're going through this, we're going to have one more section, but if you're interested in learning some more, asking questions, sharing photos, getting more advice, there is a Facebook group. It's a local, just call it a work group, Localscapes work group. You can join that group. I don't have a lot more details on that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. If you have questions for us, I'll just give you my email right now, and Hattie Ann can give you her email when she goes to the next section. It's D as in David, RICE at weberbasin.com. drice at weberbasin.com. You can send me some email with questions if you have more detailed questions about some of this stuff. But you can join that. You can join that work group, and there's lots of good information there of what's happening and different things. We can help you with ideas if you're going to move forward with this Localscape concept, or you're just stuck in an area of planning or what to do next. We can help you through some of that. So with that, are there any questions? I guess there's a couple of questions here.
I thought both of these questions would be good to answer live.
Okay. So the one question was, what about getting rid of patches of pasture grass? I'm assuming pasture grass is in your nice lawn is what she's talking about here. And it may be pasture grass, it may be quack grass. It could even be just a tall fescue that's growing up in the middle of your Kentucky bluegrass or perennial ryegrass lawn. It's a little coarser, a little more upright growth. It grows a little faster. Honestly, there is no easy way to get rid of those. There is not, if it's crabgrass, truly crabgrass, there's a crabgrass preventer and some different stuff, but crabgrass is an annual grass. It's a weedy annual grass. If this is a rooted, deep rooted perennial pasture grass or tall fescue in your nice lawn, you would need just an all around herbicide killer, Roundup, for example, and you need to kill that spot, or you need to dig it out and then just either reseed or resod that patch. There is no selective herbicide for these other types of grasses like fescues and pasture grass that'll get it out of your Kentucky bluegrass without killing your bluegrass. So keep that in mind. If you end up with big patches like that, or if you notice small patches, dig them out when they're small, because the clump of those will continue to widen. They're not aggressive spreaders, but the clump just keeps getting bigger over time, over the years, and then eventually it's a little bit hard to manage. So after you aerate, should you put down grass seed? I think weed seeds should go into the hole. Oh, okay. It's a good question. If you aerate, should you put down grass seed? Not unless your grass is already thin. The grass, if it's Kentucky bluegrass, the roots are going to grow in and fill in. I would not recommend grass seeding unless you have a thinner area. You could put down a little seed. There's potential that weed seeds could go down in those holes if you're using secondary water, it's not filtered, you don't have a filter or whatever. There's always that potential. Usually you wouldn't have that big of a deal. If you just have a big weed problem and you think it's because of aeration, it's usually not. The weed problem probably already exists. It's wind blowing in dandelions, it's other sources, or there's just weeds there. And so my recommendation, no, unless your grass is thin, don't seed it. I hope that helps you there. So with that, I think Hattie Ann, let's move on to the next section, and then we'll address any more questions as we go or at the end.
Sweet. Okay. And go back to the top here. Alrighty, wonderful. So the fifth element of a localscape is your planting bed. So notice how we've talked about everything else first, and everything has been designed and in designated areas. Your planting beds come last, which people might think is a little bit weird, but it just makes sense with the way that you plan everything. And for this specific class, we're going to be focusing on plant beds and like the 6 basic plants that you use in those plant beds, but we're not going to be going into any one thing super specifically. If you want more specifics on like design type of things, we do have a Localscapes design class that we're going to be offering. And then Localscapes itself does have that design class as well. So if you're wanting to go a little bit more into depth with that, will be in that class. But this one, we're just kind of focusing on that element. So as far as your planting beds go, there are 3 essential points to all planting beds. It's the irrigation, which is drip irrigation, the mulch, and then the plants, right? And so in this area, we have our 3D model, and we have our pathways. They don't have any gathering or activity zones in the front. They have them in the back there. But all the other empty space, that's not pathways, not your central open shape, those are going to be your planting beds. So they have their own space, your lawn has its own space, your pathways have their own spot, right? Everything else is your planting beds. So with building up your planting beds, you're going to be wanting to put the mulch in there. Mulch, you're wanting to do around 3 or 4 inches. We've kind of talked about this already, about 3 or 4 inches of the mulch. That helps reduce weed maintenance. Like Dave said, it helps regulate the soil moisture and helps the plants with keeping a little bit more moisture in their roots and things. And then drip irrigating your plant beds helps the water go to the plant, like to where you want it to go, which also reduces maintenance because you're not watering an entire area. So it's really cutting down on the weeds. And then adding plants is going to be based on your budget and also your personal, like what you want personally, and the colors that you want and the design look that you want. Oh, and we went over these things. So your drip irrigation. Oh yeah, and another thing about your drip irrigation is that it goes below the mulch. Just because that helps hide all the tubing and things. As far as mulch goes, there's a bunch of different materials that you can use. So there's your gravels and your rocks and your aggregates. And then there's also wood chips. There's the shredded bark, compost mulch. There's a lot of different things that can be used. And it all goes on pretty much your preference and how you want it to look. And there's also different colors of the shredded mulch and things. So they're all good for using as a mulch, but it just kind of depends on how you want it to look. We're going to quickly go over drip irrigation. Again, not going to go into too much depth, just because we do have an irrigation class as well. So we have the design class, and then we have the irrigation, Localscapes irrigation class also. We're just going to kind of touch on it and tell you how it's beneficial to your plant bed areas. So with the drip irrigation, it's really good because it allows water to slowly get to those plant roots and helps it to really soak into the soil. And then it helps the water not be wasted by evaporation or wind. It helps with weed control, like we talked about, because you're watering the plant, not the entire area. And it's also a lot easier to install and change. Like if you were to break a piece, it's a lot easier to fix it and change it out. There's two different types. So there's the inline drip, which has just like a hole in the tubing. And then there's the point source drip where your water is going directly to the plant. So the inline drip is more for kind of your dense areas. With your drip irrigation, you do want to consider what your area looks like. So for example, over on the right, we have a high density planting. And so that inline drip is going to be best for that because you have so many plants there that it's not going to make sense to take little pieces of the spaghetti tubing to all those different plants. It's just easier to do the inline drip and to make it kind of like a grid so that it's applying water equally to all the plants, just because the density is so high, right? But like that low planting, you can definitely do point source drip to all those different plants because they're not so close together, and you have a lot of open space for weeds to grow if you're doing that inline drip in that area, right? But if you do the point source, you're just watering those plants, so it cuts down on those weeds. And as far as some pieces, we're going to go through a little bit of like the pieces parts of irrigation. With drip irrigation, you do need a filter and a pressure reducer with it. So that's how those things look. And then these are some pieces with inline drip. So we have the retrofit head, which this will connect to a spray irrigation head that's already in the ground. So this is how you can kind of convert a spray head into a drip irrigation system, is that retrofit head. And that does have the filter and the pressure reducer inside of it. We have blank tubing. So this is the tubing that goes in areas where there aren't any plants. So it's your connective tubing. And we have the drip tubing, which you can see the little holes in there. Those are the emitters. So those are where the water is going to be coming out of. And there is different tubings with like different spacing for the emitters. They'll be like closer together, the emitters, or they'll be farther away. And then your T, your coupling, and your elbow are your different joints in connecting the tubing together. That figure 8 is it's a little piece that kind of helps cut a line off so that water's not leaking out at the end of it. And then staples, when you put the tubing down on the ground, you want to put the staples into the ground with that little curve going over the line so that it keeps the tubing down a little easier. And then you would put your mulch on top. So that just kind of helps keep everything in place. And that's kind of a good example of how the inline drip will look. And the emitters, like we showed you, are in the lines. So you're going to have water coming in. And the idea is that with mass plantings there, then it's equally like watering the bed. So it's evenly spreading water around the dense planting. And again, like it's underneath the mulch. and pretty easy maintenance to be able to fix it if needed. This inline drip is also really good for trees and shrubs, especially you do want to make sure that you're putting enough around so the tree's getting enough water. So usually you want to do at least 2 rings around the trunk of a tree. Now with point source drip, there's a little bit of a difference in the pieces. You have the retrofit head, which is the same. We have the blank tubing, which again is the runs down the length. So usually with point source drip, you have 1 line of blank tubing down your plant bed, and then you have the poly tubing, which is there on the bottom, and that's connecting to your blank tubing, and then that's going to all the different plants. Your flush valve is it's like a way to be able to close the valve manually, open it and close it manually, so that water can flush out whenever you it can flush out if it needs to be. That little Zeramin tool, that is a tool that you can use to punch holes in your blank tubing to be able to connect it to the poly tubing. And you do that with either the barbed tee. So the barbed tee, you can connect different poly tubing kind of in the same spot. And then your drip emitter there on the bottom is, if you're just doing one, you would put that into the hole that the Zeramin tool makes, and then you would connect the poly tubing to that drip emitter. And then, or wait, no, that's not right. Am I saying that right, Dave?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So usually, I mean, this can get a little more complicated, and that's why we have a whole irrigation class to discuss it. But once you use the barbed tees, that poly tubing is a 1/4 inch tubing. So all of the point source drip stuff, you're going off of 1/2 inch type of a poly blank tubing, and you're or a 3/4, and you're connecting a 1/4 inch poly tube, and you're using the barbed tees or emitters to do that. You can apply the emitter right directly from the blank tubing or at the end of the poly tubing. You could actually put the emitter in and then run poly tubing to your wherever you're ending, because the emitter is what's regulating the flow.
Right.
But usually people put in the barbed tees or the little barbed fittings into the blank tubing, run the poly tubing, also referred to as spaghetti tubing. It's that 1/4 inch. Putting the emitter on the end, using a tubing stake or something to make sure that emitter stays put at the base of the plant where you want the water to go.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the barbed tee is what goes into the blank tubing, and then the drip emitter is what goes on the end of the poly tubing, which then the water would go to the plant at that point. Sorry. Still getting to know my things still. And then again, the staple is going to be used to keep everything in place when you put the mulch on top. So that's the difference between the different materials for the different types. And then again, the emitters go to the specific plants, helps with weed control. It's installed on the surface underneath the mulch, right? So we've already kind of gone over that stuff. And then as far as doing trees and things, it's going to be different for your trees and different for your perennials. So you want to make sure that you're applying the right amount of water to your tree areas, so making sure that you have enough tubing around the tree, enough water going to that tree, right? And more emitters and things will need to be added to plants and trees as they mature, depending on how big they get. So your perennials are pretty good with keeping the same emitters, but as trees get bigger, they're of course going to need more water as they get bigger, right? So just making sure that you're doing that so that you can compensate for their growth. And then we're going to go through these few things. It's just kind of the main types of plants that we see in our plant beds. We're not going to go into any specifics, but we're just kind of going to go over each one of these and talk about how they're good for your plant beds. So we'll start with trees. And trees are a great way to be able to add height and variety to your landscape. And I mean, they have a lot of benefits to them, including they shade areas, and they can also work as a screen. And they also can provide interest in your landscape all year round, and can act as a focal point, especially if it's like a specialty kind of tree. It can work as a nice something that you want to be featured in your yard. They can also help with energy efficiency. So especially in the summer, if you have a tree that's shading your house, that's really going to help cut down on how much air conditioning that you're putting into your house, because that shade is helping to cool your house down. And then in the winter, it's helping because then the leaves go away. And so this would be for not an evergreen tree, a deciduous tree. So then in the winter, when the leaves are gone, you're getting sunlight into your house. So you're not using as much heat in your house. So they can help with energy efficiency. They provide shade for your lawns, your gathering areas, and your activity zones, which is always really nice. So you can have shady plants underneath trees. You can have shade for a nice little bench on your pathway, right? And then next thing is shrubs. Shrubs are really awesome because they also add a lot of variety and structure to your landscape. Shrubs are like the backbone of your plant beds. If you think about when all of your perennials were to die back, you still have that structure of the shrubs there, right? And so you're able to still kind of have something in your landscape when all the perennials are starting to go dormant for the winter. Nice thing about shrubs is that they're mostly low maintenance, and they give color, especially the different colors that you can find in the different shrubs. It's really awesome. These two are really good examples of fun colors that you can get from their foliage. They can also be used for privacy, so using as screens and things, help with all season interest. Again, backbone of any plant design. Shrubs are nice because they can help kind of define an area or a space. So they can kind of make you feel like you're in a room, especially if you have an outdoor gathering area and you want that to feel a little bit more enclosed. Just by putting those shrubs kind of rounded in there, it feels kind of like its own separate room, right? Next are your ornamental grasses. Dave talked about these a little bit. Grasses are really nice to be able to add light and texture into your landscape. And again, like Dave said, they're awesome because they take very little maintenance and care. Usually it's just cutting them down either in the fall or the next, or like early in the spring. And not only are they easy to take care of, they also provide a lot of winter interest if you keep them. So they can kind of help add some interest in your yard during wintertime. And then they provide movement and sound, which you don't think about until you see it happening and you're like, wow, that's really beautiful. So the wind just like slightly moving it, especially that alkali sacaton grass, when the wind blows through that, it's like the little seed heads are so small that it almost looks like glitter as it's moving. So it like looks really glittery and pretty. And then when the light hits it just right, it glows. So grasses can add a great interest into your landscape. And then it also can be a good habitat for birds. Birds like eating the seed and things. So if you're into creating a landscape that is really friendly for animals, this is a great way to add that. Again, it creates privacy. So having this area with these bigger shrubs and things around it, it's creating a nice kind of private area where you feel like you can have a little bit more of a secluded space that's kind of that's away from all your other spaces. Next are your perennials. So these are the ones that are going to add a lot of your like flowering, coloring, bursts of color all around your plant beds. Nice thing about perennials is they grow year after year, and that they bloom at different times of the year too, and that it's a good habitat for pollinators, for your bees and butterflies, and even some hummingbirds like a lot too. So I mean, they're awesome. You just want to make sure that you're staggering your bloom times and there's a lot of really, really good ones out there. So planting in layers is something that's really smart to do. It's just is really good for a design aspect of it. You can kind of see how they show you how you can create kind of like this line with your different plants, and how you want more of like your taller things to be in the background and your shorter things to be in the front, right? So that you can kind of create this line so that you're not having big things in the front and then the little things in the back so you can't see the little things, right? And then with planting beds, you do want to make sure that you're not putting annuals with your perennials. So this is something that my parents actually do, and it's not good because their planting beds are being overwatered and their plants are not doing well in there. And then, I mean, we live in an area where we get water. It's a small town, so we get water like whenever we can, but sometimes that's not enough for annuals. So then the annuals struggle in our beds too at times. So it's like this awkward medium, but annuals and perennials need different amounts of water. And so it's best not to put your annuals mixed into your perennials and planting beds, and to put them in containers instead, so that they can get the amount of water that they need. And then you can even run drip irrigation to those containers so that you can control that water more easily. Putting them in containers also helps to reduce the maintenance that's needed on annuals, just because that maintenance is a little bit higher than it is for perennials. And then next are ground covers, and Dave went through these a little bit with the central open shapes, but the Localscapes program worded it really well that it's the carpet of the landscape, right? I like that they have it that way, because it can be, especially if it's grown into an area. You can see in that the left picture, the creeping thyme mix. It looks like a carpet. It's awesome. And it's a living mulch too, which is really nice. And you don't need to mow it either. And if it's grown all the way around, it usually outcompetes most weeds, which is super nice. And there's different ones for sun, and there's some that work in shade as well. So ground covers are a great way to be able to fill in an area that you want really something low on the ground, but just have it be like a nice plant. If you want that kind of a look in the area you're thinking. And the next are bulbs, and excuse me, bulbs are really awesome because they're very water wise. They're ones that you don't really need to water. And bulbs, there's a lot of bulbs that create or that give really early spring color, when all of your other kind of perennials are starting to green up and get there. Your bulbs are starting. So we're seeing this around our gardens right now, that we have the bulbs starting to come up, and we're seeing them starting to grow while everything else is still kind of brown. So you're getting this color in the early spring while everything else is still working on getting their blooms together. And depending on your bulbs too, you can get some in the summer as well as the fall. So bulbs, there's a great variety of them, and there's something that's really easy to put in, and they're really low maintenance pretty much when they're done blooming. And it's like, especially like the tulips are a good example, because the blooms will die back, right? And then at that point, your other plants are starting to grow up, so you can just kind of chop them down. They're pretty easy to chop down. And even like if the bulbs are planted deep enough, sometimes you can even just pull them out and it'll snap at the bulb, so the bulb stays in the ground, but you've taken all of the stem out and the dying leaves, right? So they're pretty easy to care for as well. And then as far as planting times go for your plant beds, fall is the best time to plant, just because it helps the plant start establishing a little bit more, just because of the lower temperatures at the nighttime. It makes the roots almost put more energy into establishing. But the problem with that is that usually in your nurseries, you have a smaller selection of plants. Springtime is also a good time to plant. It's not as good as fall time, but this is when the selection is a lot higher. And so you just have to really make sure that it's getting enough water in that hot summertime when it's establishing. And summer is not the best time to plant just because they struggle to develop a strong root system in the summer because they're already struggling being dried out with the water, right? So that's general planting times. And as far as tree planting, there's a lot of things to consider with tree planting. Main things, well, first thing to do is that you want to make sure that you're calling the 811 hotline to make sure that you don't have any utility lines or anything in the area that you're going to be planting the tree, especially if it's a bigger tree and you're going to be needing to dig a big hole. And then you want to make sure that you're being really careful with the root ball, that the roots are kept moist, that you make the hole big enough. That's one thing that people tend to do, is not making their hole big enough. Kind of rule of thumb that's shown really well in that picture is that you want the hole to be 2 or 3 times as wide as the root ball. So you can see the width on that. It's about 3, you could fit like 3 root balls in that area. And then the hole, you want it to be as deep as the root ball, right? And too high is going to be better than too low. You don't want to put your tree too low into the ground because that can actually lead to a lot of other problems. And then you backfill with the soil that was in the hole that you dug out, unless it's all clay. Then you can backfill with something else. But you do want to backfill with some native soil. You can mix in a little bit of compost into it, but mostly you want to do the soil that was already there as your backfilling soil. And then you do want to add mulch around the tree. You don't want the mulch to be touching the trunk. So you want it to be like 1 to 2 inches away from the trunk, but then you want that mulch to be 2 to 3 inches deep around it, right? And then also with tree planting, so the reason why you want to plant higher rather than deeper is you don't want to cover the trunk flare, which is a really vital part of the tree. And then you do want to make sure you're removing the burlap and cage. You won't believe the stories that you hear of people that don't take those things off, that there's a tree in their yard and it's dying and they're wondering why. So they have someone come out and look at it and there's still a wire cage around their root ball, or there's still burlap and the roots can't go anywhere, right? So make sure that you're taking off the root ball or the wire cage and the burlap, or even like a pot. I've seen pictures where the tree was just planted in the pot in the ground. So make sure that you're taking off the things that are not biodegradable before doing it. And then staking is not always necessary. With sometimes it is, but you don't always have to stake a new tree. Sometimes if you're in like more of a windy area, you need to, or if you want to protect that tree from deer. That's one thing also that I put on here, is making sure that you're wrapping the tree in something so that deer don't ruin your brand new tree, because that's one of the main problems I saw working at a nursery, is that people would come and be like, my tree's dying and the deer scraped it. Is it gonna live? And I'd be like, no, it's not. I'm sorry, because the deers will scrape that bark right off with their antlers, and if you don't protect it against it. So big part of planting a tree is make sure you wrap it so that it can get nice and established before and bigger before a deer comes and destroys it when you just barely planted it, right? And then making sure to water your new plants enough. That's one of the main reasons why new plants will die, is because they were not watered enough and they weren't able to get established. Again, watering established plants you'll want to do with drip irrigation. And it needs its own zone, right? So it runs longer than your pop-up head. So the times are going to be different. So you just want them to be on different zones so that the timing can be correct for what you need it, depending on what you're watering, right? And then it's going to be different for your different soil types also. So clay soil, you want to typically you water once a week for 60 minutes because it takes a lot longer for that water to soak into the soil. But then sandy soil, the water moves through a lot quicker. So you're watering 2 days a week for 30 minutes. So that just kind of gives you a general idea of what it's like with different soil types. And then this is from the Conservation Garden Park. And this gives kind of a general watering guide for central or northern Utah. And it's really awesome because it does tell you like how often things should be watered. And like the timing as well, that you can start turning on your water and things, which is super awesome. Again, these slides are going to be on our website, so you can come back and reference this if need be. And then just know your plants. That's one thing that like when you go to a nursery and you just buy random things and place them random places, most like it's not going to do well if you don't know what it needs. Certain plants have certain light requirements, certain water requirements. The difference between a perennial and an annual is something that you'll want to know if they're going to work in your hardiness zone, and also their size. So make sure that you're checking the plant tags. Plants should all have these tags that will tell you all those requirements and then the size that they're going to be. So make sure that you're reading the plant tags so that you know for sure what you're getting and what it needs for as far as like light and water and things. We'll quickly go over microclimates, which microclimates are, it's an area in your yard that has kind of a different climate than the areas from around it. So like next to your house is a little bit warmer than farther away. So some plants will do better if they're closer to the house, just because it kind of creates a warmer spot. Or if like there's a microclimate on the Utah State campus where they're able to grow a specific variety of a magnolia tree because of all the different buildings around it creates this warmer area. So the magnolia tree can actually work in that area. It's on a zone that's not normal for Logan, but because of the microclimate, it's able to work. So depending on the microclimates of your yard depends on what plants may do better or worse in those areas. And that kind of goes with the different orientation of the sun as well. So like your full sun plants are going to do best in your south and west facing places because those places are going to get hot. So that sun kind of creates that microclimate there. And then even next to like this house, it retains the heat really well. So that area is just going to be very, very warm. So you're going to want to make sure you're putting plants there that can take the heat and take that full sun. And then your part sun plants require 6 hours of sun or less. So it's like 4 to 6 hours, I think. East sides of houses are usually really good with this. And most part sun plants do really good with morning sun and afternoon sun, or not afternoon, morning sun and evening sun, because that sunlight's not as harsh as your afternoon sun. So that sunlight in between like noon to 4 o'clock is really intense, and some plants can't handle that intense heat. So your part sun plants are going to do really good in areas that only get morning sunlight or evening sunlight. And then your shady plants are usually best on your north side of your house that doesn't really get sunlight at all. So just making sure that you know what the plants need and where to put them based on those needs, right? So now we have our 3D model all complete with all of our different elements, and we have our plant beds all put around all the different things. And it looks great. A lot of variation in height and color and shapes. So that's it for the planting beds. And if there's any questions that need to be answered live, we're going to do that. I think we're about at time also. So Dave, was there any questions there?
You know, there were just a few questions about some weeds and some different things, but no, there's no questions currently in the question box. But we did go a little over time. We apologize. Thank you for staying with us. There's a lot of material here. This used to be scheduled as a 3-hour class. We thought we could condense it down to 2. Maybe with some practice, we'll get it to 2. There's just a lot of material here, but we appreciate you sticking with us. If there's other questions, we are happy to address these questions through an email, through phone call. Some of you have specific questions related to irrigation. We will do an irrigation workshop. That's not really a slideshow. We try to do that one. I've got lots of irrigation parts and pieces. And so that class will try to just show you parts of irrigation and how to lay it out, how to set it up, what connects to a valve, how to set up a filter, all this stuff. So if the irrigation questions are the issue, do that. If design is kind of your problem, we're going to do that design workshop. So please sign up for that one. The perennials, because all these classes that we do individually we're trying to just provide the depth so that you can take these principles and now apply all your knowledge and be very successful in creating whatever it is you like to do. Like those few pictures you saw of some of the things I've done in my yard. I'm an average guy. Of course, I do some of this stuff, this is my background a little bit, but you can do this stuff yourself. And so, it's not beyond you doing it. I guess budget and time and maybe your physical ability plays into that. If you're just not into digging around in the dirt. For me, it's stress relief, I guess. I just do it. So anyway, we'll just move on. There's one question here about the code to enroll in the design workshop. You should have that, but if you haven't had that, actually, will you please call us for that? We're going to do that. We have to limit the size for that design workshop. So if you'll call our number or send us an email, we will send you a code if you're very interested in that. I hate to just throw it out there in this class, even though this is a prerequisite. If you're serious about design, please call. We'll get you that code to register. And the number to call is just the main number, 801-771-1677. Ask for David or Hattie Ann, and we'll get you the code for that. That class will be limited to about 30 attendees. And we're going to make that live interactive so you can verbally ask questions and we'll engage with you that way because we want to be able to help you with the design. It's going to take 2 hours, 3 hours or something. And you're going to hopefully leave with a good base design when we're done. And if we have 100 people, we just can't manage it. But we feel like 30, we can manage and provide enough one-on-one attention for you. So I hope that answers that. That was a long ramble.
I also want to add to that, Dave. So with the code, that usually comes with attending the design class. It's how we've set it up because
she's talking about actually signing up for the design class. So you have to get the code first.
No, so we've had it as like the design class, and then the workshop is separate because we were doing that one-on-one help. So I think that they find the code at the end of the design class, and I do recommend taking the design class because the nice thing about the design class is that you get a little bit more in depth of a thing, and then if you need that extra workshop help after the class, then you sign up for the workshop. But I don't know if that's what he was wondering about, but yeah. I just wanted to add that real fast.
Yeah, but certainly call us. We'll get you in there. We'll get you what you need to keep moving forward with this and get some help. We just appreciate it. I don't know that there's any other questions. Just for those that are still on with us, next week, Wednesday night, it'll be a park strip class. It's focused specific to park strips. It's just a 1 hour type class. We'll give you lots of good ideas for that one. We're doing some Q&As for follow-ups of previous classes. If you have specific questions related to the pruning that we've done, pruning of fruit trees, pruning of ornamentals, those are coming up in the next couple weeks. And then of course, a weeds class, a healthy turf class, and another vegetable class all this month. So, any interest there, please join us. We're happy to have you. We're glad you're joining us. We just look forward to continuing having you with us. And as you have time, please come out to the garden. There's still a little bit of snow. We're in Layton on the east side, but there's a little bit of snow in the shady spots. But please come out and you can watch the garden. The garden is meant to be an example of these principles as well. You can watch that garden progress in what's blooming each season and kind of take the ideas and apply them back to your own yard too. That's what it's for. It's public garden, meant for your ideas, meant for your learning. And we're working on other resources there as well as plant lists and different things, databases that'll help you be successful as you go forward.
Awesome.
So she's saying there's another question about the class on the 27th. In order to register, you have to have the code. Yeah, that's the code I was mentioning earlier. So if you'll please just call us and we'll make sure you can get in there. At least the first come first serve type situation. Once it reaches that 30 cap, we'll just tell you, sorry, this one's full. We'll be doing another, but we're spreading those out, every 6 weeks, 8 weeks or so. If the first one fills up, we will do another and we'll continue to help you. Or you can set up a time and we'll be happy to try to help you one-on-one here and there. Hattie Ann can make some time for you. And it'll be a little different setting, but you could bring your base in and we could kind of guide you, give you half an hour to an hour and guide you through some steps just one-on-one if we need that.
Yep. Awesome.
Okay. Well, I think that's wraps it up. I think we'll go ahead and conclude. And again, thanks for joining us. Have a good night.
Sweet. Bye-bye, everybody.
All right. Bye.